Pale Blood Hunt. Written by Redgrave. Narrated by J. Britton.
Oh, yeah. Pale blood.
Fear the Old Blood. Chapter 1. Bergenworth, Cause, and the Vacuous Spider. Everything begins at Bergenworth. An old institution of learning. Bergenworth was built in a peaceful, secluded area, away from the neighboring city and close to a great lake. It is here that a group of individuals studied and explored the depths of human knowledge.
Bergenworth is an old place of learning.
Good.
And the tomb of the
All
gods
signed and sealed.
below Yharnam should be familiar to
Now, let's begin the transfusion.
Once a group of
Oh,
young
don't you worry.
scholars discovered a holy medium deep
Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad
the
dream.
establishment of blood healing. In this sense,
Ladder had them fight twice more. Each duel was shorter than the last, and each resulted in a draw, which frustrated the Golden Dragon more than it did Aragon or Arya. Ladder would have kept them sparring until it became abundantly clear who was the better warrior, but by the end of the last duel, they were both so tired that they dropped to the ground and lay side by side, heaving for air, and even Gladder had to admit that it would be counterproductive, if not downright harmful, for them to continue. Once they had recovered enough to stand and walk, Gladder summoned them to Aragon's tent. Once they first, with energy from Saphira, they healed their more painful injuries. Then they returned their ruined shields to the Varden's weapon master, Frederick, who provided them with replacements, although only after lecturing them on how they ought to take better care of their equipment.
You found yourself a
When they
hunter.
arrived at the tent, they found Nasuda waiting for them, along with her usual accompaniment of guards. "It's about time," she said in a tart voice. "If the two of you are done trying to batter each other to pieces, we need to talk." Without another word, she ducked inside. Blodgrim and his fellow spellcasters arranged themselves in a large circle around the tent, which Aragon could tell made Nasuda's guards uneasy. Aragon and Arya followed Nasuda into the tent, then Saphira surprised them by pushing the front of her head past the entrance flaps and promptly filling the cramped space with the smell of smoke and burnt meat. The sudden appearance of Saphira's scaly snout took Nasuda aback, but she quickly recovered. Addressing herself to Aragon, she said, "That was Gladder I felt, wasn't it?" He glanced toward the front of the tent, hoping that her guards were too far away to hear, then nodded. "It was." "Ah, I knew it," she exclaimed, sounding satisfied. Then her expression became uncertain. "May I speak with him? Is it allowed, or will he only communicate with an elf or a rider?" Aragon hesitated and looked to Arya for guidance. "I don't know," he said. "He still hasn't entirely recovered. He may not want to." "I will speak with you, Nasuda, daughter of a jihad," Gladder said, his voice echoing in their heads. Ask of me what you will, then leave us to our work. There is much that still needs to be done in order to prepare Aragon for the challenges ahead. Aragon had never seen Nasuda look awestruck before, but now she did. Where? She mouthed, and spread her hands. He pointed at a patch of dirt by his bed. Nasuda raised her eyebrows, then she nodded, and drawing herself up, she formally greeted Glatter. An exchange of pleasantries followed, during the course of which Nasuda inquired after Glatter's health and asked if there was anything the Varden could provide him with. In response to the first question, which had made Aragon nervous, Glatter politely explained that his health was just fine, thank you, and as far as the second matter went, he needed nothing from the Varden, though he appreciated her concern. I no longer eat, he said, I no longer drink, and I no longer sleep as you would understand it. My only pleasure now, my only indulgence, lies in contemplating how I might bring about Galbatorix's downfall. That, said Nasuda, I can understand, for I feel much the same. Then she asked Glatter if he had any advice as to how the Varden could capture Dras Leona without it costing them an unacceptable amount of men and materiel, as well as, in her words, handing over Aragon and Saphira to the Empire, like so many trussed-up chickens. She spent some time explaining the situation to Glatter in greater specificity, whereupon, after due consideration, he said, I have no easy solution for you, Nasuda. I will continue to think on it, but at the moment, I cannot see a way clear for the Varden. If Murtaugh and Thorn were by themselves, I might easily overcome their minds. However, Galbatorix has given them too many Eldenari for me to do that. Even with Aragon, Saphira, and the elves to help, victory would be no sure thing. Visibly disappointed, Nasuda was silent for a brief while, then she pressed her hands flat against the front of her dress and thanked Glatter for his time. She bade them farewell and took her leave, stepping carefully around Saphira's head so as not to touch her. Aragon relaxed somewhat as he sat on his cot, while Arya seated herself on a short, three-legged stool. He wiped his palms on the knees of his trousers, for his hands felt sticky, as did the rest of him, then offered Arya a drink from his waterskin, which she gratefully accepted. When she was finished, he gulped down several mouthfuls himself. Their sparring had left him ravenous. The water stifled the growls and rumbles coming from his stomach, but he hoped that Glatter would not detain them for much longer. The sun had nearly set, and he wanted to get a hot meal from the Varden's cooks before they damped their fires and turned in for the night. Otherwise, he knew he would end up gnawing on stale bread, dried strips of meat, moldy sheep cheese, and if he was lucky, a raw onion or two, hardly an appealing prospect. Once they were both settled, Glatter began to speak, lecturing Aragon on the principles of mental combat. These Aragon was already familiar with, but he listened closely, and when the Golden Dragon told him to do something, he followed Glatter's instructions without question or complaint. They soon progressed beyond maxims to applied practice. Glatter started by testing Aragon's defenses with attacks of ever-increasing strength, which then led to them engaging in all-out battles where they each struggled to obtain dominance, even if for only a moment, over the other's thoughts. While they fought, Aragon lay on his back with his eyes closed, all of his energies concentrated inward on the tempest that raged between him and Glatter. His earlier exertions had left him weak and thick-headed, whereas the Golden Dragon was fresh and well-rested, in addition to being immensely powerful, and that made it difficult for Aragon to do much more than foil Glatter's attacks. Nevertheless, he managed to hold his own reasonably well, knowing that, in a real fight, the winner would have undoubtedly been Glatter. Fortunately, Glatter made some allowances for Aragon's condition, although, as he said, you must be ready to defend your innermost self at any given moment, even when you are sleeping. It may very well be that you will end up facing Galbatorix or Murtaugh when you are as exhausted as you are now. After two more bouts, Glatter withdrew to the role of a very vocal spectator, while he had Arya take his place as Aragon's antagonist. She was just as tired as Aragon, but he quickly found that, when it came to a wizard's duel, she was more than his equal. It did not surprise him. The one time before they had clashed in their minds, she had almost killed him, and that was when she was still drugged from her captivity in Gilead. Glatter's thoughts were disciplined and focused, but even he could not match the iron-bound control Arya exerted over her consciousness. Her self-mastery was a trait Aragon had noticed was common among the elves. Foremost in that regard had been Oromis, who, it seemed to Aragon, had been in such perfect command of himself, never the slightest doubt or worry had bothered him. Aragon considered the elves' restraint an innate characteristic of their race, as well as a natural outcome of their rigorous upbringing, education, and use of the ancient language. Speaking and thinking in a language that prevented one from lying, and every word of which contained the potential to unlock a spell, discouraged carelessness in thought or speech and fostered an aversion to allowing one's emotions to sweep one away. As a rule, then, elves possessed far more self-control than the members of other races. He and Arya wrestled with their minds for a few minutes, he seeking to escape her all-encompassing grip, she seeking to pin and hold him so that she could impose her will on his thoughts. She caught him several times, but he always wiggled free after a second or two, though he knew, had she meant him harm, it would have been too late to save himself. And the whole time their minds were touching, Aragon was aware of the wild strains of music that wafted through the dark spaces of Arya's consciousness. They lured him away from his own body and threatened to snare him in a web of strange and eerie melodies that had no counterparts among earthly songs. He would have happily succumbed to the bewitchment of the music had it not been for the distraction of Arya's attacks and the knowledge that humans did not often fare well if they became too fascinated with the workings of an elf's mind. He might escape unscathed. He was a rider, after all. He was different, but it was a risk he was not willing to take, not so long as he valued his sanity. He had heard that delving into Blodgrim's mind had reduced Nasuda's garb into a slack-jawed dreamer. So he resisted the temptation, hard as it was. Then Gladder had Saphira join the fray, sometimes in opposition to Aragon and sometimes in support of him, for as the elder dragon said, "You must be as skilled in this as Aragon, Brightscales." The addition of Saphira substantially altered the outcome of their mental struggles. Together she and Aragon were able to fend off Arya with regularity, if not ease. Their combined might even allowed them to subdue Arya on 2 separate occasions. When Saphira was allied with Arya, however, the two of them so outstripped Aragon that he gave up any attempt at offense and, instead, retreated deep inside himself, curling into a tight ball like a wounded animal while he recited scraps of verse and waited for the waves of mental energy they hurled at him to subside. Lastly, Gladder had them pair off, he with Arya, and Aragon with Saphira, and they fought a duel like that, as if they were 2 sets of riders and dragons met in combat. For the first few strenuous minutes, they were fairly matched, but in the end, Gladder's strength, experience, and cunning combined with Arya's rigorous proficiency proved too much for Aragon and Saphira to overcome, and they had no choice but to concede defeat. Afterward, Aragon sensed discontent emanating from Gladder. Stung by it, he said, "We'll do better tomorrow, Master." Gladder's mood darkened further. Even he seemed weary from their practice. "You did well enough, youngling. I could not have asked any more from either of you had you been placed under my wing as apprentices in Groingard. However, it is impossible for you to learn what you need to learn in a matter of days or weeks. Time gushes between our teeth like water, and soon it will all be gone. It takes years to master the art of fighting with your mind, years and decades and centuries, and even then, there is still more to learn, more to discover, about yourself, about your enemies, and about the very underpinnings of the world." With an angry growl, he fell silent. "Then we will learn what we can and let fate decide the rest," said Aragon. "Besides, Galbatorix may have had 100 years to train his mind, but it has also been over 100 years since you last caught him. He's sure to have forgotten something in the interim. With you helping us, I know we can beat him." Gladder snorted. "Your tongue grows ever smoother, Aragon Shadeslayer." Nevertheless, he sounded pleased. He admonished them to eat and rest, and then he withdrew from their minds and said no more. Aragon was sure that the Golden Dragon was still watching them, but Aragon could no longer feel his presence, and an unexpected sense of emptiness settled over him. A chill crept through his limbs, and he shivered. He, Saphira, and Arya sat in the darkening tent, none of them willing to speak. Then, rousing himself, Aragon said, "He seems better." His voice creaked from disuse, and he again reached for the water skin. "This is good for him," said Arya. "You are good for him. Without something to give him purpose, his grief would have killed him. That he has survived at all is impressive. I admire him for it. Few beings, human, elf, or dragon, could continue to function rationally after such a loss. Brahm did. He was equally remarkable. If we kill Galbatorix and Shruakan, how do you think Gladder will react?" Saphira asked. "Will he keep going, or will he just stop?" Arya's pupils reflected a shimmer of light as she looked past Aragon toward Saphira. "Only time will tell. I hope not, but if we are triumphant in Urubayan, it may very well be that Glatter will find he is no longer able to continue on his own, without Oromas. We can't just let him give up. I agree. It is not our place to stop him if he decides to enter the void, Arya said sternly. The choice is his to make, and his alone. Yes, but we can reason with him and try to help him see that life is still worth living. She was still for a while, her face solemn, then she said, I do not want him to die. No elf does. However, if every waking moment is a torment to him, then won't it be better for him to seek release? Neither Aragon nor Saphira had an answer for her. The three of them continued to discuss the day's events for a short while longer. Then Saphira pulled her head out of the tent and went to sit on the neighboring patch of grass. I feel like a fox with her head stuck down a rabbit hole, she complained. It makes my scales itch, not being able to see if someone is creeping up on me. Aragon expected Arya to leave as well, but to his surprise, she stayed, seemingly content to sit and talk with him about this and that. He was only too eager to comply. His earlier hunger had vanished during his bouts of mental combat with her, Saphira, and Glatter, and in any case, he was more than willing to forego a hot meal in exchange for the pleasure of her company. Night closed in around them, and the camp grew ever quieter as their conversation meandered from one topic to another. Aragon felt giddy from exhaustion and excitement, almost as if he had drunk too much mead, and he noticed that Arya also seemed more at ease than normal. They talked of many things, of Glatter and of their sparring, of the siege of Leona and what might be done about it, and of other, less important matters, such as the crane Arya had seen hunting among the rushes by the edge of the lake, and the scales Saphira had lost from her nose, and how the season was turning and the days were again growing colder. But always they returned to the one topic that was ever present in their thoughts, and that was Galbatorix and what awaited them in Urubayan. While they speculated, as they had so many times before, about the types of magical traps Galbatorix might have set for them and how best to avoid them, Aragon thought of Saphira's question about Glader, and he said, Arya. Yes, she drew the word out, her voice rising and falling with a faint lilt. What do you want to do once this is all over? If we're still alive, that is. What do you want to do? He fingered Breisinger's pommel as he considered the question. I don't know. I haven't let myself think much past Urubayan. It would depend on what she wants, but I suppose Saphira and I might return to Palanker Valley. I could build a hall on one of the foothills of the mountains. We might not spend much time there, but at least we would have a home to return to when we weren't flying from one part of Algesia to another. He half smiled. I'm sure there will be plenty to keep us busy, even if Galbatorix is dead. But you still haven't answered my question. What will you do if we win? You must have some idea. You've had longer to think about it than I have. Arya drew one leg up onto the stool, wrapped her arms around it, and rested her chin on her knee. In the dim half-light of the tent, her face appeared to float against a featureless black background, like an apparition conjured out of the night. I have spent more time among humans and dwarves than I have among the Alphakin, she said, using the elf's name in the ancient language. I have grown used to it, and I would not want to return to live in Elsmera. Too little happens there. Centuries can slip by without notice while you sit and stare at the stars. No, I think I will continue to serve my mother as her ambassador. The reason I first left New Weldengarden was because I wanted to help right the balance of the world. As you said, there will still be much that needs doing if we manage to topple Galbatorix, much that needs putting right, and I would be a part of it. Ah, it was not exactly what he had hoped she might say, but at least it presented the possibility that they would not entirely lose contact after Urubayan, and that he would still be able to see her now and then. If Arya noticed his discontent, she gave no sign of it. They talked for another few minutes, then Arya made her excuses and rose to leave. As she stepped past him, Aragon reached toward her, as if to stop her, then quickly drew back his hand. Wait, he said softly, unsure of what he hoped for, but hoping nevertheless. The beat of his heart increased, pounding in his ears, and his cheeks grew warm. Arya paused with her back to him by the entrance of the tent. Good night, Aragon, she said. Then she slipped out between the entrance flaps and vanished into the night, leaving him to sit alone in the dark. Discovery. The next 3 days passed quickly for Aragon, if not for the rest of the Varden, who remained mired in lethargy. The standoff with Leona continued unabated, although there was some excitement when Thorn altered his customary location from above the front gates to a section of the rampart several hundred feet to the right. After much discussion, and after consulting extensively with Saphira, Nasuda and her advisors concluded that Thorn had relocated for no other reason than comfort. The other section of rampart was somewhat flatter and longer. Aside from that, the siege lumbered on without change. Meanwhile, Aragon spent the mornings and evenings studying with Gladder and the afternoons sparring with Arya and several other elves. His matches with the elves were not as long or strenuous as his previous one with Arya, for it would have been foolish to push himself that hard every day, but his sessions with Gladder were as intense as ever. The ancient dragon never flagged in his efforts to improve Aragon's skills and knowledge, and he made no allowances for mistakes or exhaustion. Aragon was pleased to find that he was finally able to hold his own when dueling with the elves. But it was mentally taxing, for if his concentration lapsed for even a moment, he would end up with a sword jabbed in his ribs or pressed against his throat. With his lessons from Gladder, he made what would have been considered exemplary progress under normal circumstances, but given the situation, both he and Gladder were frustrated with the pace of his learning. On the second day, during his morning lesson with Gladder, Aragon thought to say, "Master, when I first arrived at the Varden in Farthendur, the twins tested me. They tested my knowledge of the ancient language, and of magic in general." "You told this to Oromis. Why repeat it to me now?" "Because, it occurred to me, the twins asked me to summon the true form of a silver ring. At the time, I didn't know how. Arya explained it to me later. How, with the ancient language, you can conjure up the essence of anything or creature. Yet Oromis never spoke of it, and I was wondering, why not?" Gladder seemed to sigh. Summoning the true form of an object is a difficult kind of magic. In order for it to work, you must understand everything of importance about the object in question, even as you must in order to guess the true name of a person or animal. Furthermore, it's of little practical value. And it's dangerous. Very dangerous. The spell cannot be structured as a continuing process that you can end at any time. Either you succeed in summoning the true form of an object, or you fail and die. There was no reason for Oromis to have you try anything so risky, nor were you advanced enough in your studies to even discuss the topic. Aragon shuddered inwardly as he realized just how angry Arya must have been with the twins to summon the true form of the ring they held. Then he said, "I would like to try it now." Aragon felt the full force of Gladder's attention focused on him. "Why? I need to know if I have that level of understanding, even if only for one small thing." Again, why? Unable to explain with words, Aragon poured his jumble of thoughts and feelings into Gladder's consciousness. When he finished, Gladder was silent for a while, digesting the flow of information. "Am I right to say," began the dragon, "that you equate this with defeating Galbatorix? You believe that if you can do this and live, then you might be able to defeat the king?" "Yes," said Aragon, relieved. He had been unable to articulate his motivation as clearly as the dragon, but that was exactly it. "And are you determined to try this?" "Yes, master." "It may kill you," Gladder reminded him. "I know." "Aragon," exclaimed Saphira, her thoughts faint in his mind. She was flying high above the camp, watching for possible danger while he studied with Gladder. "It's far too dangerous. I won't allow it. I have to do this," he replied quietly. To Saphira, but also to Aragon, Gladder said, "If he insists, then it is best he tries where I can watch. If his knowledge fails him, I may be able to supply the needed information and save him." Saphira growled, an angry, ripping sound that filled Aragon's mind, and then, from outside the tent, Aragon heard a fearsome rush of air and startled cries from men and elves as she dove to the ground. She landed with such force, the tent and everything in it shook. A few seconds later, she stuck her head into the tent and glared at Aragon. She was panting, and the wind from her nostrils ruffled his hair and made his eyes water from the odor of burnt meat. "You're as thick-headed as a colt," she said. "No more than you." Her lip curled in a hint of a snarl. "Why are we waiting? If you must do this, let us be done with it." "What will you choose to summon?" asked Gladder. "It must be something you are intimately familiar with." Aragon let his gaze drift over the interior of the tent, then down to the sapphire ring he wore on his right hand. He had only taken the ring off since a jihad had given it to him from Brahm. It had become a part of his body as surely as his arms or legs. During the hours he had spent looking at it, he had memorized every curve and facet, and if he closed his eyes, he could call up an image that was a perfect reproduction of the actual object. But for all that, there was much he did not know about the ring, its history, how the elves had made it, and, ultimately, what spells might or might not be woven into its fabric. No, not Aaron. Then his gaze slid from the ring to the pommel of Reisinger, where the sword stood leaning against the corner of his cot. Reisinger, he murmured. A muffled whump emanated from the blade, and the sword rose a half-inch out of its scabbard, as if pushed from beneath. Small tongues of flame leapt up from the mouth of the sheath, licking the underside of the hilt. The flames vanished and the sword slid back into the scabbard as Aragon quickly ended the unintentional spell. Reisinger, he thought, utterly certain of his choice. It had been Runan's skill that had crafted the sword, but it was he who had wielded the tools, and he had been joined with the elfsmith's mind throughout the process. If there was any one object in the world he understood through and through, it was his sword. "Are you sure?" asked Ladder. Aragon nodded, then caught himself as he remembered the golden dragon could not see him. "Yes, master. A question, though, is Reisinger the true name of the sword, and if not, do I need its true name for the spell to work?" Reisinger is the name of fire, as you well know. The true name of your sword is undoubtedly something far more complicated, although it might very well include Brisingar within its description. If you wish, you could refer to the sword by its true name, but you could just as easily call it sword and achieve the same result, so long as you maintain the proper knowledge at the forefront of your mind. The name is merely a label for the knowledge, and you do not need the label in order to make use of the knowledge. It is a subtle distinction, but an important one. Do you understand? I do. Then proceed as you will. Aragon took a moment to collect himself. Then he found the nub in the back of his mind and reached through it to tap his body's store of energy. Channeling that energy into the word he spoke, while also thinking about everything he knew of the sword, he said clearly and distinctly, "Reisinger." Aragon felt his strength ebb precipitously. Alarmed, he tried to speak, tried to move, but the spell bound him in place. He could not even blink or breathe. Unlike before, the sheathed sword did not burst into flame. It wavered, like a reflection in water. Then, in the air next to the weapon, a transparent apparition appeared, a perfect, glowing likeness of Reisinger free of its sheath. As well made as was the sword itself, and Aragon had never found so much as a single flaw, the duplicate floating before him was even more refined. It was as if he received the idea of the sword, an idea that not even Runan, with all her experience working metal, could hope to capture. As soon as the manifestation became visible, Aragon was again able to breathe and move. He maintained the spell for several seconds, so he could marvel at the beauty of the summoning, and then he let the spell slip free of his grasp and the ghostly sword slowly faded into oblivion. In its absence, the inside of the tent seemed unexpectedly dark. Only then did Aragon again become aware of Saphira and Ladder pressing against his consciousness, watching with steadfast attentiveness every thought that flickered through his mind. Both of the dragons were as tense as Aragon had ever felt them. If he were to poke Saphira, he guessed she would be so startled, she would twist herself in circles. "And if I were to poke you, nothing would be left but a spear," she commented. Aragon smiled and lowered himself onto the cot, tired. In his mind, Aragon heard a sound like wind rushing across a lonely plain as Ladder relaxed. "You did well, Chancellor." Ladder's praise surprised Aragon. The old dragon had given out few enough compliments since he had begun teaching Aragon. "But let us not try it again." Aragon shivered and rubbed his arms, trying to dispel the cold that had crept into his limbs. "Agreed, Master." It was not an experience he was eager to replicate. Still, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had proven without a doubt that there was at least one thing in Alagasia that he could do as well as anyone possibly could. And that gave him hope. On the morning of the third day, Roran arrived back at the bargain, along with his companions, tired, wounded, and travel-worn. Roran's return stirred the Barden from their slumber for a few hours. He and the others with him were given a hero's welcome, but an air of boredom soon settled over the majority of the Barden again. Aragon was relieved to see Roran. He had known his cousin was safe, as he had scryed him several times while he was gone. Nevertheless, seeing him in person freed Aragon of an anxiety that, until that very moment, he had not realized he was carrying. Roran was the only family he had left. Murtaugh did not count, as far as Aragon was concerned, and Aragon could not bear the thought of losing him. Now, seeing Roran up close, Aragon was shocked by his appearance. He had expected Roran and the others to be exhausted, but Roran seemed far more haggard than his companions. He looked as if he had aged 5 years over the course of the trip. His His eyes were red and dark-ringed, his brow was lined, and he moved stiffly, as if every inch of his body was covered in bruises. And then there was his beard, which had been burned half off and which now had a mottled, mangy appearance. The 5 men, one less than their original number, went first to visit the healers of Duvrangar Gata, where the spellcasters attended to their wounds. Then they presented themselves to Nasuda in her pavilion. After commending them for their bravery, Nasuda dismissed all of the men except Roran, whom she asked to deliver a detailed account of his journey to Enframaruz, as well as the capture of the city itself. The telling took some time, but both Nasuda and Aragon, who was standing by her right hand, listened with sometimes horrified attention while Roran spoke. When he finished, Nasuda surprised both him and Aragon by announcing that she was placing Roran in charge of one of the Varden's battalions. Aragon expected the news to please Roran. Instead, he saw the lines in his cousin's face deepen and his brows draw together in a frown. Roran made no objection or complaint, however, but bowed and said in his rough voice, "As you wish, Lady Nasuda." Later, Aragon walked Roran to his tent, where Katrina was waiting for them. She greeted Roran with such an obvious display of emotion that Aragon opened his eyes, embarrassed. With Saphira, the 3 of them dined together, but Aragon and Saphira excused themselves as soon as they could, for it was obvious that Roran had no energy for company and Katrina wished to have him for himself. As he and Saphira wandered through the camp in the deepening dusk, Aragon heard someone behind him shout, "Aragon! Aragon! Wait a moment." He turned to see the thin, gangly figure of the scholar Jayad running toward him, strands of hair flying around his lean face. In his left hand, Jayad clutched a ragged scrap of parchment. "What is it?" Aragon asked, worried. "This," exclaimed Jayad, his eyes gleaming. He held up the parchment and shook it. "I've done it again, Aragon. I found a way." In the fading light, the scar on his scalp and temple appeared startlingly pale against his tan skin. "You've done what again? You found one way? Slow down, you're not making sense." Jayad glanced around furtively, then he leaned close to Aragon and whispered, "All my reading and searching has paid off. I've discovered a hidden tunnel that leads straight into Dras Leona. Decisions." "Explain it to me again," said Nasuda. Aragon shifted his weight, impatient, but he held his tongue. From the piles of scrolls and books in front of him, Jayad picked up a slim book bound in red leather and began his narrative for the 3rd time. "Some 500 years ago, as best I can tell." Jormungandr interrupted him with a motion of his hand. "Leave out your qualifiers. We know this is speculation." Jayad began again. "Some 500 years ago, Queen Forna sent Erst Greybeard to Dras Leona, or rather what was to become Dras Leona." "And why did she send him?" asked Nasuda while she toyed with the fringe of her sleeve. "The dwarves were in the midst of a clan war, and Forna hoped that she could secure the support of our race by helping King Radgar with the planning and construction of the fortifications for the city, even as the dwarves engineered the defenses for Haruz." Nasuda rolled a strand of cloth between her fingers. "And then Dolgrath Halfstave killed Forna." Ellipsis quote. "I, and Erst Greybeard had no choice but to return to the Beaver Mountains as fast as he could, to defend his claim from Halfstave's relations." When Jayad held up a finger, then opened the red book, before he left, it seems Erst then started his book. King Radgar's chief advisor, Lord Yarkman, wrote in his memoirs that Erst had begun to draw up plans for the sewer system underneath the center of the city, since that would affect how the fortifications would be built. From his place at the far end of the table that filled the middle of Nasuda's pavilion, Auric nodded and said, "That's true enough. You have to work out where and how the weight is distributed and determine what's appropriate for the kind of earth you're dealing with. Otherwise, you're liable to have cave-ins." Jayad continued, "Of course, Dras Leona doesn't have underground sewers, so I assumed that nothing like Erst's plans were ever put into effect. However, 2 pages later, Yarkley says, peering down his nose at the book, Jayad read, and in a most lamentable turn of events, the Reavers burned many a house and made off with many a family treasure. The soldiers were slow to respond, for they had been full of work underground, laboring like common peasants." Jayad lowered the book. "Now, what were they excavating?" "I was unable to find any further mention of subterranean activities in or around Dras Leona, until, putting down the red volume, he selected another book, this one a massive, wood-paneled tome nearly a foot thick. I happened to be perusing the Acts of Taradas and other mysteries of occult phenomena as recorded throughout the ages of men, dwarves, and the most ancient elves when It is a work filled with mistakes, said Arya. She stood by the left side of the table, leaning on both hands over a map of the city. The author knew little of my people, and really did not know, he invented. That may be, said Jayad, but he knew a great deal about humans, and it is humans we are interested in. Jayad opened the book close to the middle and gently lowered the upper half to the table, so it lay flat. During his investigations, Othman spent some time in this region. He mainly studied Helgrind and the strange happenings associated with it, but he also had this to say about Gros Leona. The people of the city also often complain of peculiar sounds and odors wafting up from under their streets and floors, especially at night, which they attribute to ghosts and spirits and other uncanny creatures. But if they are spirits, they are unlike any I have heard of before, as spirits elsewhere seem to avoid enclosed spaces. Jayad closed the book. Fortunately, Othman was nothing if not thorough, and he marked the locations of the sounds on a map of Gros Leona, where, as you can see, they form a nearly straight line through the old part of the city. And you think this indicates the presence of a tunnel, said Nasuda. It was a statement, not a question. I do, said Jayad, bobbing his head. Sitting next to Nasuda, Orin, who had said little, spoke. Nothing you have shown us so far, Goodman Jayad, has yet to prove that this is actually a tunnel. If there is a space under the city, it might very well be a cellar or a catacomb or some other chamber that only leads to the building above. Even if it is a tunnel, we do not know if it exits anywhere outside of Gros Leona, or, assuming its existence, where it would lead. To the heart of the palace, perhaps? What's more, by your own account, it's likely the construction of this hypothetical tunnel was never completed in the first place. It seems unlikely it could be anything but a tunnel, given its shape, Your Majesty, said Jayad. No cellar or catacomb would be so narrow or long. As for whether it was completed, we know it was never used for its intended purpose, but we also know that it lasted at least up until Othman's time, which means the tunnel or passageway or what have you must have been finished to some degree, otherwise the seep of water would have destroyed it long ago. What of the exit, then, or the entrance, if you will, asked the king. Jayad scrabbled among the piles of scrolls for a few moments before pulling out another map of Gros Leona, this one showing a portion of the surrounding landscape. That I can't be sure about, but if it does lead out of the city, then it would exit somewhere around here. He placed his index finger on a spot close to the eastern side of the city. Most of the buildings outside the walls that protected the heart of Gros Leona were located on the western side of the city, next to the lake. This meant that the location Jayad was pointing at, though empty land, was closer to the center of Gros Leona than one could get from any other direction without encountering buildings. But it's impossible to tell without going there to look for it in person. Aragon frowned. He had thought Jayad's discovery would be more certain. You are to be congratulated on your research, Goodman Jayad, said Nasuda. You may have once again performed a great service for the bargain. She rose from her high-backed chair and walked over to look at the map. The hem of her dress rustled as it dragged across the ground. If we send a scout to investigate, we risk alerting the Empire to our interest in that area. Assuming the tunnel exists, it would be of little value to us then. Murtaugh and Thorn would be expecting us on the other end. She looked at Jayad. How wide do you think this tunnel would be? How many men can fit in it? I couldn't say. It might be. Auric cleared his throat, then said, the earth here is soft and clay-like, with a fair bit of silver paper throughout it, horrible for tunneling. If Ersk had any sense, he wouldn't have planned to have one large channel carry away the city's waste. He would have laid down several smaller passageways, to reduce the likelihood of a cave-in. I'd guess that none of them would be wider than a yard or so. Too narrow for more than a single man to pass through at a time, said Jayad. Too narrow for more than a single woman, added Auric. Nasuda returned to her seat and stared at the map with focused eyes, as if she were gazing at something far away. After a few moments of silence, Aragon said, I could search for the tunnel. I know how to hide myself with magic. The sentries would never see me. Perhaps, murmured Nasuda, but I still don't like the idea of having you or anyone else running about. The likelihood of the Empire noticing is too high. What if Murtaugh is watching? Could you fool him? Do you even know what he is capable of now? She shook her head. No, we must act as if the tunnel exists and make our decisions accordingly. If events prove otherwise, it won't have cost us anything, but if the tunnel is there, it should allow us to capture Gros Leona once and for all. What have you in mind? Asked King Orin in a tone of caution. Something unexpected. Aragon snorted softly. Perhaps you should consult Roran, then. I have no need of Roran's help in devising my plans, Aragon. Nasuda fell silent again, and everyone in the pavilion, including Aragon, waited to see what she would come up with. At last she stirred and said, we sent a small team of warriors to open the gates from the inside. And how is anyone supposed to manage that? Demanded Auric. It would be tricky enough if all they had to face were the hundreds of soldiers stationed in the area, but in case you have forgotten, there's also a giant, fire-breathing lizard lounging close by, and he's sure to take an interest in anyone foolish enough to pry open the gates. And that's not even taking Murtaugh into account. Before the discussion could devolve, Aragon said, I can do it. The words had an immediate, chilling effect on the conversation. Aragon expected Nasuda to reject his suggestion out of hand, but she surprised him by considering it. Then she surprised him further when she said, very well. All the arguments Aragon had built up fell away as he stared at Nasuda with astonishment. She had obviously followed the same chain of reasoning as he had. The tent erupted in a confusion of overlapping voices as everyone began to speak at once. Arya won out over the din. Nasuda cannot allow Aragon to endanger himself so. It would be unconscionable. Send some of Blodgrim's spellcasters instead. I know they would agree to help, and they are as mighty warriors as any you can find, including Aragon. Nasuda shook her head. None of Galbatorix's men were there to help Aragon. Not Murtaugh, not the king's pet magicians, not even the lowest of soldiers. We should use that to our advantage. Besides, Aragon is our strongest spellcaster, and it may require a great deal of strength to force open the gates. Of all of us, he has the best chance of success. What if he is captured, though? He can't hold his own against Murtaugh. You know that. We'll distract Murtaugh and Thorn, and that will give Aragon the opportunity he needs. Arya lifted her chin. How? How will you distract them? We'll make as though to attack Dras Leona from the south. Saphira will fly around the city, setting buildings on fire and killing soldiers on the walls. Thorn and Murtaugh will have no choice but to give chase, especially since it will appear as if Aragon is riding Saphira the whole time. Blodgrim and his fellow spellcasters can conjure up a facsimile of Aragon, as they did before. As long as Murtaugh doesn't get too close, he'll never discover our subterfuge. You are determined in this? I am. Arya's face hardened. Then I will accompany Aragon. Relief seeped through Aragon. He had hoped she would go with him, but he had been uncertain whether to ask, for fear she would refuse. Nasuda sighed. You are Islandzadi's daughter. I would not like to place you in such danger. If you were to die, remember how your mother reacted when she thought Durza had killed you. We cannot afford to lose the help of your people. My mother, Arya clamped her lips shut, cutting herself off, then began anew. I can assure you, Lady Nasuda, Queen Islandzadi shall not abandon the Varden, whatever may happen to me. Of that, you need have no concern. I will accompany Aragon, as will two of Blodgrim's spellcasters. Nasuda shook her head. No, you can only take one. Murtaugh is familiar with the number of elves who have been protecting Aragon. If he notices that two or more are missing, he may suspect a trap of some sort. In any event, Saphira will need as much help as she can get if she's to keep out of Murtaugh's grasp. 3 people are not enough to attempt such a mission, insisted Arya. We would be unable to ensure Aragon's safety, much less open the gates. Then one of Dubrangar Gada can go with you as well. A hint of derision colored Arya's expression. None of your spellcasters are strong or skilled enough. We'll be outnumbered 100 to 1, or worse. Both ordinary swordsmen and trained magicians will be arrayed against us. Only elves or riders. Or shades, Auric grumbled. Or shades, Arya conceded, though Aragon could tell she was irritated. Only those can hope to prevail against such odds. And even then it is no sure thing. Let us take 2 of Blodgrim's spellcasters. No one else is fit for the task, not among the Varden. Oh, and what am I, chopped liver? Everyone turned to look, surprised, as Angela stepped forward from a corner at the back of the tent. Aragon had not even suspected she was there. What a strange expression, said the herbalizer. Prepare themselves to chop liver in the first place. If you have to choose an organ, why not give a gallbladder for Clima's plan instead? Much more interesting than a liver. Or what about chopped tea? She smiled. Well, I suppose that's not important. She stopped in front of Arya and looked up at her. Will you object if I accompany you, Alpha? I'm not a member of the Varden. not strictly speaking, but I'm still willing to round out this quartet of yours. Much to Aragon's surprise, Arya bowed her head and said, "Of course, wise one. I meant no offense. It would be an honor to have you with us." "Good," exclaimed Angela. "That is, assuming you don't mind," she said, directing her words to Nasuda. Appearing somewhat bemused, Nasuda shook her head. "If you are willing, and neither Aragon nor Arya objects, then I can think of no reason why you shouldn't go. I can't imagine why you want to, though." Angela tossed her curls. "Do you expect me to explain every decision I make? Oh, very well, if it'll satisfy your curiosity. Let's say I have a grudge against the priests of Helheim, and I'd like the chance to do them some mischief. And besides, if Murdoch puts in an appearance, I have a trick or two up my sleeve that might give him a bit of a turn." "We should ask Helga to go with us as well," said Aragon. "If anyone can help us avoid danger." Nasuda frowned. Last we spoke, she made her position clear enough. I'll not go bowing and scraping to her in an attempt to convince her otherwise. "I'll talk with her," said Aragon. "I'm the one she's angry with, and I'm the one who should ask her." Nasuda plucked at the fringe of her golden dress. She rolled several strands between her fingers, then abruptly said, "Do as you wish. I dislike the thought of sending a child, even one as gifted as Elva, into battle. However, I suppose she is more than capable of protecting herself. As long as the pain of those around her doesn't overwhelm her," said Angela. The last few battles have left her curled in a ball, barely able to move or breathe. Nasuda stilled her fingers and peered at Aragon with a serious expression. "She's unpredictable. If she does choose to go along, be careful of her, Aragon." "I will," he promised. Then Nasuda began to discuss questions of logistics with Orin and Auric, and Aragon withdrew somewhat from the conversation, for he had little to contribute. In the privacy of his mind, he reached out to Saphira, who had been listening, through him, to the goings-on. "Well?" he asked. "What do you think? You've been awfully quiet. I thought for sure you would say something when Nasuda proposed sneaking into Dras Leona." "I said nothing because I had nothing to say. It is a good plan. You agree with her? We are no longer awkward younglings, Aragon. Our enemies may be fearsome, but so are we. It is time we remind them of that."
Oh, yeah.
"Does it bother you that we'll be apart?" "Of course it bothers me," she growled. "Wherever you go, enemies flock to you like flies to flesh. However, you are not as helpless as you once were." And she almost seemed to purr. "Me, helpless?" he said with mock outrage. "Only a little bit, but your bite is more dangerous than before. So is yours. I go to hunt. A wing-breaking storm is building, and I'll not have a chance to eat again until after we attack." "Fly safely," he said. As he felt her presence receding from him, Aragon returned his attention to the conversation within the tent, for he knew his life, and that of Saphira, would depend on the decisions Nasuda, Auric, and Orin would make. Under hill and stone. Aragon rolled his shoulders, trying to get his mail hauberk to rest comfortably under the tunic he wore to hide the armor. Darkness lay all around them, heavy and oppressive. A thick layer of clouds obscured the moon and the stars. Without the red wearlight Angela held in the palm of her hand, even Aragon and the elves would have been unable to see. The air was humid, and once or twice, Aragon felt a few cold drops of rain strike his cheeks. Elva had laughed and refused when he had asked for her help. He had argued with her long and hard, but to no avail. Saphira had even intervened, flying down to the tent where the witch-child was staying and placing her massive head just feet away from the girl, forcing her to look into one of Saphira's brilliant, unblinking eyes. Elva had not had the temerity to laugh then, but she remained obdurate in her refusal. Her stubbornness frustrated Aragon. Still, he could not help but admire her strength of character. To say no to both a rider and a dragon was no small thing. Then again, she had endured an incredible amount of pain in her short life, and the experience had hardened her to a degree rarely seen even in the most jaded of warriors. Beside him, Arya fastened a long cloak around her neck. Aragon wore one as well, as did Angela and the black-haired elf Werden, whom Blodgrim had chosen to accompany them. The cloaks were needed to protect them against the night chill, as well as to conceal their weapons from anyone they might encounter in the city, if they got that far. Nasuda, Jormungandr, and Saphira had accompanied them to the edge of the camp, where they now stood. Among the tents, the men of the Varden, dwarves, and Urgles were busy preparing to march forth. Don't forget, said Nasuda, her breath steaming in front of her, if you can't reach the gates by dawn, find somewhere to wait until tomorrow morning, and we'll try again then. We may not have the luxury of waiting, said Arya. Nasuda rubbed her arms and nodded. She appeared unusually worried. I know. Either way, we'll be ready to attack as soon as you contact us, no matter the time of day. Your safety is more important than capturing Dros Leona. Remember that. Her gaze drifted toward Aragon as she spoke. We should be off, said Worden. The night grows old. Aragon pressed his forehead against Saphira for a moment. Good hunting, she said softly. And you as well. They reluctantly parted, and Aragon joined Arya and Worden as they followed Angela away from the camp, heading toward the eastern edge of the city. Nasuda and Jormungandr murmured well wishes and farewells as they strode past, and then all was quiet, save the sounds of their breathing and of their boots on the ground. Angela dimmed the light in her palm until it was barely right enough for Aragon to see his feet. He had to strain his eyes to spot rocks and branches that lay in the way. They walked in silence for nearly an hour, at which point the herbalist stopped and whispered, "We're here, as best I can tell. I'm fairly good at reckoning distances, but we might be off by more than 1,000 feet. It's hard to be certain of anything in this gloom." Off to their left, a half-dozen pinpricks of light floated above the horizon, the only evidence that they were anywhere near Dros Leona. The lights seemed close enough to pluck from the air. He and the two women gathered around Worden as the elf knelt and pulled the glove off his right hand. Placing his palm against the bare earth, Worden began to croon the spell he had learned from the dwarven magician whom, ere they left on their mission, Oric had sent to instruct them in the ways of detecting underground chambers. While the elf sang, Aragon stared into the surrounding blackness, listening and watching for enemies. The fall of raindrops on his face increased. He hoped the weather would improve before battle was joined, if battle was to be joined. An owl hooted somewhere, and he reached for Risinger, only to stop himself and clench his fist. Barzil, he said to himself, using Oric's favorite curse. He was more nervous than he ought to be. The knowledge that he might be about to fight Murtaugh and Thorn again, singly or together, had him on edge. I'll be sure to lose if I keep on like this, he thought. So he slowed his breathing and initiated the first of the mental exercises Ladder had taught him for establishing control over his emotions. The old dragon had not been enthusiastic about the mission when Aragon told him about it, but neither had he opposed it. After discussing various contingencies, Ladder had said, "Beware of the shadows, Aragon. Strange things lurk in dark places," which, Aragon thought, was hardly an encouraging statement. He wiped the accumulated moisture off his face, keeping his other hand close to the hilt of his sword. The leather of his glove was warm and smooth against his skin. Lowering his hand, he hooked his thumb under his sword belt, the belt of Beloth the Wise, conscious of the weight of the 12 flawless diamonds concealed within. That morning, he had gone to the livestock pens, and as the cooks killed the birds and sheep for the army's breakfast, he had transferred the animals' dying energy into the gems. He hated doing so. When he reached out with his mind to an animal, if it still had its head attached, the animal's fear and pain became his own, and as it slipped into the void, he felt as if he himself were dying. It was a horrible, panic-inducing experience. Whenever he could, he had whispered words in the ancient language to the animals in an attempt to comfort them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes not. Though the creatures would have died in any case, and though he needed the energy, he hated the practice, for it made him feel as if he were responsible for their deaths. It made him feel unclean. Now he fancied that the belt was slightly heavier than before, laden as it was with the energy from so many animals. Even if the diamonds within had been worthless, Aragon would have regarded the belt as valuable beyond hope, on account of the dozens of lives that had gone into filling it. As Worden ceased singing, Arya asked, "Have you found it?" "This way," said Worden, standing. Relief and trepidation swept through Aragon. Jayad was right. Worden led them over a road and a series of small hills, then down into a shallow wash hidden within the folds of the land. "The mouth of the tunnel should be somewhere here," said the elf, and gestured at the western bank of the depression. The herbalist increased the brightness of her wearlight enough for them to search by. Then Aragon, Arya, and Worden began to comb through the brush along the side of the bank, poking at the ground with sticks. Twice Aragon barked his shins against the stumps of fallen birch trees, causing him to suck in his breath with pain. He wished he was wearing braces, but he had left them behind, along with his shield, because they would have attracted too much attention in the city. For 20 minutes, they searched, ranging up and down the bank as they worked their way out from their starting point. At last, Aragon heard a metal, and then Arya softly called, "Here." He and the others hurried toward her, where she stood by a small, overgrown hollow in the side of the bank. Arya drew aside the brush to reveal a smoke-lined tunnel 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide. A rusting iron grate covered the gaping hole. "Look," said Arya, and she pointed at the ground. Aragon looked, and he saw a path leading out of the tunnel. Even by the weird red illumination of the herbalist's wearlight, Aragon could tell that the trail had been worn into place by the passage of tramping feet. One or more people must have been using the tunnel to surreptitiously enter and exit Dros Leona. "We should proceed with caution," whispered Morgan. Angela made a faint noise in her throat. "How else were you planning to proceed? With blaring trumpets and shouting heralds? Really?" The elf refrained from answering, but he appeared distinctly uncomfortable. Arya and Werden pulled off the grating and cautiously moved into the tunnel. Both conjured birdlights of their own. The flameless orbs floated over their heads like small red suns, though they emitted no more light than a handful of coals. Aragon hung back and said to Angela, "Why do the elves treat you so respectfully? They seem almost afraid of you. Am I not deserving of respect?" He hesitated. "One of these days, you know, you're going to have to tell me about yourself." "What makes you think that?" And she pushed past him to enter the tunnel, her cloak flapping like the wings of a leather blaka. Shaking his head, Aragon followed. The short herbalist did not have to bend much in order to avoid bumping into the ceiling, but Aragon had to hunch like an old man with rheumatism, as did the two elves. For the most part, the tunnel was empty. A fine layer of caked dirt covered the floor. A few sticks and rocks, and even a discarded snakeskin, were scattered in the mouth of the tunnel. The passageway smelled like damp straw and moth wings. Aragon and the others walked as quietly as they could, but the tunnel magnified sounds. Every bump and scrape echoed, filling the air with a multitude of overlapping whispers that seemed to murmur and sigh with a life of their own. The whispers made Aragon feel as if they were surrounded by a host of disembodied spirits who were commenting on their every move. So much for sneaking up on anyone, he thought as he scuffed his boot against a rock, which bounced against the side of the tunnel with a loud clack that multiplied 100-fold as it spread through the tunnel. "Sorry," he mouthed as everyone looked at him. A wry smile touched his lips. "At least we know what causes the strange sounds underneath Dros Leona." He would have to tell Jayad on their return. When they had gone a fair ways down the tunnel, Aragon paused and looked back at the entrance, which was already lost in darkness. The gloom seemed almost palpable, like a heavy cloth draped over the world. Combined with the close-set walls and low ceiling, it left him feeling cramped and constricted. Normally, he did not mind being in enclosed places, but the tunnel reminded him of the warren of rough-hewn passageways within Helgrind where he and Rorik had fought the Rizak, hardly a pleasant memory. He took a deep breath, then released it. Just as he was about to continue forward, he caught a glimpse of two large eyes gleaming in the shadows, like a pair of copper-colored moonstones. He grabbed Brisinger and had already drawn the sword several inches from its scabbard when Solumbum appeared out of the murk, padding along on silent paws. The werecat stopped at the edge of the light. He twitched his black-tipped ears, and his jaws parted in what seemed to be an expression of amusement. Aragon relaxed and acknowledged its presence with a dip of his head. "I should have guessed." Wherever Angela went, Solumbum invariably followed. Again Aragon wondered about the herbalist's past. How did she ever win his loyalty? As the rest of the party grew distant, the shadows crept over Solumbum once more, hiding him from Aragon's sight. Comforted by the knowledge that the werecat was watching his back, Aragon hurried to catch up. Before the group left the camp, Nasuda had briefed them on the exact number of soldiers in the city, as well as where they were stationed and their duties and habits. She had also given them details about Murtaugh's sleeping quarters, what he ate, and even his mood the previous evening. Her information had been remarkably precise. When questioned, she had smiled and explained that, since the Martin had arrived, werecats had been spying for her within Dros Leona. Once Aragon and his companions emerged within the city, the werecats would escort them to the southern gates but would not reveal their own presence to the Empire if at all possible, else they would no longer be able to supply Nasuda with intelligence as effectively. After all, who would suspect that the unusually large cat lounging nearby was actually an enemy spy? It occurred to Aragon then, as he reviewed Nasuda's briefing, that one of Murtaugh's greatest weaknesses was that he still had to sleep. than one, if we could manage it. 3 or 4 days without proper sleep and he'd be in no fit shape to fight. On and on they went through the tunnel, which ran straight as an arrow, never bending, never turning. Aragon thought he detected a slight upward slant to the floor, which would make sense, as it was designed to channel waste out of the city, but he was not entirely sure. After a while, the dirt beneath their feet began to soften and stick to their boots, like wet clay. Water dripped from the ceiling, sometimes landing on the nape of Aragon's neck and rolling down his spine, like the touch of a cold finger. He slipped once on a patch of mud and, when he put out a hand for balance, found the wall covered in slime. An indeterminate amount of time passed. They might have spent an hour in the tunnel. They might have spent 10. Or maybe it was only a few minutes. Whatever the case, Aragon's neck and shoulders hurt from standing half bent over, and he grew tired of staring at what seemed to be the same 20 feet of rose-hued stone. At last he noticed the echoes were waning and ever more delay was appearing between each repetition of the sounds. Soon afterward, the tunnel disgorged them into a large rectangular chamber with a ridged, half-domed ceiling over 15 feet high at its apex. The chamber was empty, except for a rotting barrel in one corner. Across from them, 3 identical archways opened to 3 identical rooms, small and dark. Where those led, Aragon could not see. The group stopped, and Aragon slowly straightened his back, wincing as his sore muscles stretched. This would not have been part of Erst Greybeard's plans, said Arya. Which path should we pick? Asked Worden. Isn't it obvious? Asked the herbalist. The left one. It's always the left one. And she strode toward that selfsame arch even as she spoke. Aragon could not help himself. Left according to which direction? If you were starting from the other side, left. Left would be right and right would be left. Yes, yes, said the herbalist. Her eyes narrowed. Sometimes you're too clever for your own good, Shadeslayer. Very well, we'll try it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you to end up wandering around here for days on end. Aragon would actually have preferred to take the center archway, as it seemed the most likely to lead them up to the streets, but he did not want to get into an argument with the herbalist. Either way, we'll find stairs soon enough, he thought. There can't be that many chambers under Dros Leona. Holding her round her lock, Angela took the lead. Worden and Arya followed while Aragon brought up the rear. The room through the rightmost archway was larger than it had first appeared, for it extended to the side for 20 feet, then turned and continued for another few yards, whereupon it ended in a corridor studded with empty sconces. Down the corridor was another small room lined with 3 arches, each of which led to rooms with even more archways, and so on. Who built these and why? Aragon wondered, bewildered. All the rooms they saw were deserted and empty of furnishings. The only things they found within were a 2-legged stool that fell apart when he nudged it with the tip of his boot and a pile of broken pottery lying in a corner beneath a veil of spiderwebs. Angela never hesitated or seemed confused about which direction to go, for without fail, she chose the path to the right. Aragon would have objected, except that he could think of no better alternative to her method. The herbalist stopped when they arrived at a circular room with 7 equally spaced archways placed along the walls. 7 corridors, including the one they had just traversed, stretched out from the archways. Mark where we came from, or we'll get completely turned around, said Arya. Aragon went to the corridor and, with the tip of Breisinger's crossguard, scratched a line on the stone wall. As he did, he peered into the darkness, searching for a glimpse of Solumbum, but he saw not so much as a whisker. Aragon hoped the werecat had not gotten lost somewhere in the maze of rooms. He almost reached out with his mind to find him, but resisted the urge. If anyone else felt him groping around, it might alert the Empire to their location. Ah! Exclaimed Angela, and the shadows around Aragon shifted as the herbalist stood on tiptoe and raised her werelight as high as she could. Aragon hurried to the center of the room, where she stood with Arya and Worden. What is it? He whispered. The ceiling, Aragon, murmured Arya. Look at the ceiling. He did as he was told, but saw only blocks of ancient, mold-covered stones crazed with so many cracks, it seemed amazing the ceiling had not collapsed long ago. Then his vision shifted and he gasped. The lines were not cracks but rather deeply carved runes, rows of them. They were neat and small, with sharp angles and straight stems. Mold and the passage of centuries had obscured parts of the text, but most of it remained legible. Aragon struggled with the runes for a short while, but he recognized only a few of the words, and those were spelled differently than he was used to. What does it say? He asked. Is it Dwarvish? No, said Worden. It is the language of your people, but as it was spoken and written long ago, and of a very particular dialect, that of the Zealot Tosk. The name struck a chord in Aragon. When Roran and I rescued Katrina, we heard the priests of Helgrind mention a book of Tosk. Worden nodded. It serves as the foundation of their faith. Tosk was not the first to offer up prayers to Helgrind, but he was the first to codify his beliefs and practices, and many others have imitated him since. Those who worship Helgrind regard him as a prophet of the divine. And this, the elf cast his arms out wide, is a history of Tosk, from his birth to his death. A true history, such as his disciples have never shared with those outside their sect. We could learn much from this, said Angela, never taking her eyes off the ceiling. If only we had the time. Aragon was surprised to see her so enthralled. Arya glanced at the 7 corridors. A moment, then, but read quickly. While Angela and Worden perused the runes with avid intensity, Arya walked over to one of the archways and, in an undertone, began to chant a spell for finding and locating. When she finished, she waited a moment with her head cocked, then moved on to the next archway. Aragon stared at the runes a bit longer. Then he returned to the mouth of the corridor that had brought them to the room and leaned against a wall while he waited. The cold of the stones seeped into his shoulder. Arya stopped in front of the 4th archway. The now familiar cadence of her recitation rose and fell like a soft sigh of wind. Again, nothing. A faint tickling on the back of his right hand caused Aragon to look down. A huge, wingless cricket clung to his glove. The insect was hideous, black and bulbous, with barbed legs and a massive, skull-like head. Its carapace gleamed like oil. Aragon shuddered, his skin crawling, and shook his arm, flinging the cricket into the darkness. It landed with an audible thump. The 5th corridor proved no more fruitful for Arya than the preceding 4. She bypassed the opening where Aragon stood and stationed herself in front of the 7th archway. Before she could cast her spell, a guttural yowl echoed down the corridors, seemingly from all directions at once. Then there was a hiss and a spat and a screech that made every hair on Aragon's body stand on end. Angela whirled around. Solumbum. As one, the 4 of them drew their blades. Aragon backed into the center of the room, his gaze darting from one archway to the next. His Gedvi Ignatia itched and tingled like a flea bite, a useless warning, for it did not tell him where or what the danger was. This way, said Arya, moving toward the 7th archway. The herbalist refused to budge. No, she whispered vehemently. We have to help him. Aragon noticed that she held a short sword with a strange colorless blade that flashed gem-like in the light. Arya scowled. If Murtaugh learns we're here, we'll... It happened so quickly and silently, Aragon would never have noticed had he not been looking in the right direction. A half-dozen doors hidden within the walls of 3 different corridors swung open, and 30 or so black-garbed men ran out toward them, swords in hand. Letta, shouted Worden, and the men in one group collided with each other as if those in front had run headlong into a wall. Then the rest of the attackers fell upon them, and there was no time for magic. Aragon easily parried a stab, and with a looping backhanded stroke, sliced off the attacker's head. Like all the others, the man wore a kerchief tied over his face, so only his eyes were exposed, and the kerchief fluttered as the head fell spinning toward the floor. Aragon was relieved when he felt Brisinger sink into flesh and blood. For a moment, he had feared that their opponents were protected by spells or armor, or, worse, that they were something other than human. He skewered another man through the ribs and had just turned to deal with 2 more of his attackers when a sword that should not have been there arced through the air toward his throat. His wards saved him from certain death, yet with the blade an inch away from his neck, Aragon could not help but stumble back. To his astonishment, the man he had stabbed was still standing, blood streaming down his side, seemingly oblivious to the hole Aragon had poked through him. Dread settled over Aragon. They can't feel pain, he shouted, even as he frantically blocked swords from 3 different directions. If anyone heard him, they failed to respond. He wasted no more time talking, but concentrated on fighting the men in front of him, trusting his companions to protect his back. Aragon lunged and parried and dodged, whipping Brisinger through the air as if it weighed no more than a switch. Ordinarily, he could have killed any of the men in an instant, but the fact that they were impervious to pain meant that he had to either behead them, stab them through the heart, or cut them and hold them off until loss of blood rendered them unconscious. Otherwise, the attackers kept trying to kill him, regardless of their injuries. The number of men made it difficult to evade all of their blows and strike back in return. He could have stopped defending himself and just let his wards protect him, but that would tire him just as quickly as swinging Breisinger. And since he could not predict exactly when his wards would fail, as they must at a certain point, else they would kill him, and he knew he might need them later on, he fought just as carefully and cautiously as if he were facing men whose swords could kill or maim with a single stroke. More black-garbed warriors streamed out of the hidden doorways within the corridors. They crowded around Aragon, pushing him back through sheer weight of numbers. Hands clung to his legs and arms, threatening to immobilize him. Coerced, he growled under his breath, uttering one of the 12 death words Oromas had taught him. As he had suspected, his spell had no effect. The men were warded against direct magical attacks. He quickly readied a spell Murtaugh had once used on him. Brista Vinter. It was a roundabout way of striking at the men, as he was not actually hitting them but rather pushing the air against them. In any case, it worked. A howl of wind filled the chamber, clawing at Aragon's hair and cloak and sending the men closest to him flying back into their compatriots, clearing a space of 10 feet in front of him. His strength decreased commensurately, but not enough to incapacitate him. He turned to see how the others were doing. He had not been the first to find a way to circumvent the men's wards. Bolts of lightning extended from Worden's right arm and wrapped themselves around any warrior unfortunate enough to pass in front of him. The glowing cables of energy appeared almost liquid as they writhed around their victims. Still more men were forcing their way into the room, however. "This way," cried Arya, and sprang toward the 7th corridor, the one she had failed to examine before the ambush. Worden followed, as did Aragon. Angela brought up the rear, limping and clutching at a bloody cut on her shoulder. Behind them, the black-garbed men hesitated, milling in the chamber for a moment. Then, with a mighty roar, they gave chase. As he sprinted down the corridor, Aragon strove to compose a variation of his earlier spell that would allow him to kill the men instead of just knocking them away. He quickly devised one and held it in readiness to use as soon as he could see a fair number of the attackers. Who are they? He wondered. How many of them are there? Up ahead, he glimpsed an opening through which shone a faint purplish light. He just had time to feel apprehensive about its source before the herbalist uttered a loud cry, and there was a dull orange flash and a teeth-jarring thud, and the smell of sulfur filled the air. Aragon whirled around to see 5 men dragging the herbalist through a doorway that had opened in the side of the corridor. "No!" yelled Aragon, but before he could stop it, the door swung shut as silently as it had opened, and the wall appeared perfectly solid once more. "Breisinger!" he shouted, and his sword erupted in flame. He placed the tip against the wall and attempted to push it through the stone, intending to cut open the door. The stone was thick, though, and slow to melt, and he soon realized it would take far more energy than he was willing to sacrifice. Then Arya appeared beside him, and she placed a hand where the door was and murmured, "Ladrin, open." The door remained stubbornly closed, but Aragon was embarrassed. He had not thought to try that first. Their pursuers were so close by now that he and Arya had no choice but to turn and face them. Aragon wanted to cast the spell he had invented, but the corridor was only wide enough for 2 men to approach at a time. He would not be able to kill the rest, as they were hidden from sight. Better to keep the spell a secret, he decided, and save it for when he could wipe out most of the warriors at once. He and Arya beheaded the 2 lead men, then attacked the next pair of warriors as they stepped over the bodies. In quick succession, they killed 6 more men, but there seemed to be no end of them. "Through here," shouted Worden. "Stenar Slauda," exclaimed Arya, and all along the corridor, up to a few yards from where she stood, the stones in the walls exploded into the passageway. The hail of sharp fragments caused the black-clad men to cower and falter, and more than one fell to the floor, crippled. Together Aragon and Arya turned to follow Worden, who was running toward the opening at the end of the corridor. The elf was only 30 feet away from it. Then 10. Then 5. And then a thicket of amethyst spikes shot out of holes in the floor and the ceiling, catching Worden between them. The elf seemed to float in the middle of the corridor, the spikes less than an inch away from his skin as his wards repelled the crystal thorns. Then a crackling discharge of energy ran the length of each spike and the needle-sharp tips flared painfully bright, and with an unpleasant crunch, they slid home. Worden screamed and thrashed, and then his wearlight went out and he moved no more. Aragon stared with disbelief as he stumbled to a stop before the spikes. For all his experience in battle, he had never before been present at the death of an elf. Worden and Blodgrim and the rest of their cohort were so accomplished, Aragon had believed that the only way they were likely to die was while fighting either Galbatorix or Murtaugh. Arya appeared equally stunned. She rallied quickly, however. Aragon, she said in an urgent voice, cut us a path with Brisinger. He understood. His sword, unlike hers, would be impervious to whatever evil magic the spikes contained. He drew back his arm and swung as hard as he could. A half-dozen of the spikes shattered beneath Brisinger's adamantine edge. The amethyst emitted a bell-like tone as it broke, and when the shards struck the ground, they tinkled like ice. Aragon kept to the right of the corridor, making sure not to hit the blood-streaked spikes that held up Worden's body. Again and again he swung, hacking his way through the glittering thicket. With every blow, he sent pieces of amethyst flying through the air. One sliced his left cheek, and he winced, surprised and concerned that his wards had failed. The jagged remnants of the broken spikes forced him to move carefully. The stumps below could easily pierce his boots, while the ones above threatened to cut him about the head and neck. Still, he managed to navigate to the far side of the thicket with only a small gash on his right calf, which stung whenever he put his weight on the leg. The black-clad warriors nearly caught up with them as he helped Arya past the last few rows of spikes. Once she was free, they rushed through the opening and into the purplish light, Aragon with every intention of then turning around and confronting their attackers head-on and killing every last one of them in retaliation for Worden's death. On the other side of the opening was a dark, heavily built chamber that reminded Aragon of the caves under Trondheim. A huge circular pattern of inlaid stone, marble and chalcedony and polished hematite, occupied the center of the floor. Around the edge of the patterned disc stood rough, fist-sized chunks of amethyst set within silver collars. Each piece of the purple rock glowed softly, the source of the light they had seen from the corridor. Across the disc, against the far wall, was a large black altar draped with a gold and crimson cloth. Pillars and candelabra flanked the altar, with a closed door on each side. All this Aragon saw as he barreled into the room, in the brief instant before he realized that his momentum was going to carry him through the ring of amethysts and onto the disc. He tried to stop himself, tried to turn aside, but he was moving too fast. Desperate, he did the one thing he could. He jumped toward the altar, hoping he could clear the disc in a single bound. As he sailed over the nearest of the amethyst stones, his last feeling was regret, and his last thought was of Saphira. To feed a god. The first thing Aragon noticed was the difference in the colors. The stone blocks in the ceiling appeared richer than before. Details that had been obscure now seemed sharp and vivid, while others that had been prominent were subdued. Below him, the sumptuous nature of the patterned disc was even more apparent. It took him a moment to understand the reason for the change. Arya's red wearlight no longer illuminated the chamber. Instead, what light there was came from the muted glow of the crystals and the lit candles in the candelabra. Only then did he realize that something was crammed into his mouth, stretching his jaw painfully wide, and that he was hanging by his wrists from a chain mounted in the ceiling. He tried to move and found that his ankles were shackled and secured to a metal loop in the floor. As he twisted in place, he saw Arya next to him, trussed and suspended in the same manner. Like him, she was gagged with a ball of cloth in her mouth and a rag tied around her head to hold it in place. She was already awake and watching him, and he saw she was relieved at his return to consciousness. Why hasn't she escaped already? He wondered. Then, what happened? His thoughts felt thick and slow, as if he were drunk with exhaustion. He looked down and saw that he had been stripped of his weapons and armor. He was clad only in his leggings. The belt of Beloth the Wise was gone, as was the necklace the dwarves had given him that prevented anyone from scrying him. Looking up, he saw that the elf ring Aaron was missing from his hand. A touch of panic gripped him. Then he reassured himself with the knowledge that he was not helpless, not so long as he could work magic. Because of the cloth in his mouth, he would have to cast a spell without uttering it aloud, which was somewhat more dangerous than the normal method, for if his thoughts strayed during the process, he might accidentally select the wrong words, but not so dangerous as casting a spell without any use of the ancient language at all, which was perilous indeed. In any event, it would take only a small amount of energy for him to free himself, and he was confident he could do it without too much trouble. He closed his eyes and gathered his resources in preparation. As he did, he heard Arya rattling her chain and making muffled noises. Glancing over, he saw her shaking her head at him. He raised his eyebrows in a wordless inquiry. "What is it?" But she was unable to do anything more than grunt and continue to shake her head. Frustrated, Aragon cautiously pushed out his mind toward her, alert for the slightest hint of intrusion from anyone else, but to his alarm, he felt only a soft, indistinct pressure surrounding him, as if bales of wool were packed around his mind. Panic began to well up inside of him again, despite his efforts to control it. He was not drugged. Of that, he was sure. But he did not know what else besides a drug could prevent him from touching Arya's mind. If it was magic unlike any he was familiar with. He and Arya stared at each other for a moment, then a stir of motion drew Aragon's eye upward and he saw lines of blood running down her forearms from where the manacles around her wrists had scraped away the skin. Rage engulfed him. He grabbed the chain above him and yanked on it as hard as he could. The links held, but he refused to give up. In a frenzy of anger, he pulled on it again and again, without regard for the harm he was causing himself. At last he stopped and hung limply while hot blood dripped from his wrists onto the back of his neck and shoulders. Determined to escape, he delved into the flow of energy within his body and, directing the spell at his shackles, he mentally shouted, Kaverst Malmer du Hilders Edtha, Mar Freema Nathan Aka Threya. He screamed into his gag as every nerve in his body seared with pain. Unable to maintain his concentration, he lost his grip on the spell, and the enchantment ended. The pain vanished at once, but it left him devoid of breath, with his heart pounding as heavily as if he had just jumped off a cliff. The experience was similar to the seizures he had suffered before the dragons healed the scar on his back during the Aga de Bladren. As he slowly recovered, he saw Arya gazing at him with a concerned expression. She must have tried a spell herself. Then, how could this have happened? The two of them bound and helpless, word and dead, the herbalist captured or slain, and Solemn but most likely lying hurt somewhere in the underground maze, if the black-clad warriors had not already killed the werecat. Aragon could not understand it. He, Arya, Worden, and Angela had been as capable and dangerous a group as any in Algesia. And yet they had failed, and he and Arya were at the mercy of their enemies. If we can't escape, he shied away from the thought. It did not bear dwelling on. More than anything, he wished he could contact Saphira, if only to be assured that she was still safe and to take comfort in her companionship. Though Arya was with him, he felt incredibly alone, and that unnerved him most of all. Despite the agony in his wrists, he resumed pulling on the chain, convinced that if he just kept at it long enough, he could work it loose from the ceiling. He tried twisting it, thinking it would be easier to break that way, but the fetters around his ankles kept him from turning very far to either side. The sores on his wrist eventually forced him to stop. They burned like fire, and he was afraid he might end up cutting into muscle if he continued. Also, he worried he might lose too much blood, as the sores were already bleeding heavily, and he did not know how long he and Arya would have to hang there, waiting. It was impossible to tell what time it was, but he guessed that they had been captives for only a few hours at the most, given that he did not feel the need to eat, drink, or relieve himself. That would change, though, and then their discomfort would only increase. The pain in Aragon's wrists made every minute seem unbearably long. Occasionally, he and Arya would stare at each other and try to communicate, but their efforts always failed. Twice his sores crusted over enough that he risked yanking on the chain again, but to no avail. For the most part, he and Arya endured. Then, when Aragon had begun to wonder if anyone was ever going to come, he heard the clang of iron bells from somewhere in the tunnels and passageways, and the doors on either side of the black altar swung open on silent hinges. Aragon's muscles tensed in anticipation. He fixed his eyes on the openings, as did Arya. A seemingly endless minute passed. With a brash, jarring toll, the bells sounded again, filling the chamber with a swarm of angry echoes. Through the doorways marched 3 novitiates, young men garbed in golden cloth, each carrying a metal frame hung with bells. Behind them followed 24 men and women, not one of whom possessed a full set of limbs. Unlike their predecessors, the cripples wore robes of dark leather, tailored to match their individual infirmities. And last of all, 6 oiled slaves carried in a bier, upon which, propped upright, rested an armless, legless, toothless, seemingly sexless figure, the high priest of Helgrind. From its head rose a 3-foot-high crest, which only made the creature appear even more misshapen. The priests and novitiates positioned themselves around the edge of the patterned disc on the floor, while the slaves gently lowered the bier onto the altar at the head of the room. Then the 3 perfect, handsome young men shook the bells once more, creating a discordant crash, and the leather-clad priests chanted a short phrase so quickly that Aragon was not sure what they said, though it had the sound of ritual. Amongst the crush of words, he caught the names of the three peaks of Helgrind, Gorm, Ilda, and Fel Angbara. The high priest gazed at him and Arya with eyes like chips of obsidian. "Welcome to the halls of Tosk," it said, and its withered mouth distorted the words. "Twice now you have invaded our inner sanctums, Dragon Rider. You shall not have the opportunity to do so again. Galbatorix would have us spare your lives and send you to Rubaean. He believes he can force you to serve him. He dreams of resurrecting the riders and restoring the race of dragons. I say his dreams are folly. You are too dangerous, and we do not want to see the dragons resurgent. It is commonly believed that we worship Helgrind. That is a lie we tell others to conceal the true nature of our religion. It is not Helgrind that we revere. It is the old ones who made their lair within and to whom we sacrificed our flesh and blood. The Rizak are our gods, Dragon Rider, the Rizak and the Lether Blaka." Dread crept through Aragon like a sickness. The high priest spat at him, and spittle drooled from its slapped lower lip. "There is no torture horrible enough for your crime, Rider. You killed our gods, you and that accursed dragon of yours. For that, you must die." Aragon struggled against his bonds and tried to shout through his gag. If he could talk, he could stall for time by telling them what the Rizak's last words had been, perhaps, or by threatening them with Saphira's vengeance. But their captors showed no inclination to remove his gag. In a hideous gesture, the high priest smiled, showing its gray gums. "You will never escape, Rider. The crystals here were enchanted to trap any who might try to desecrate our temple or steal our treasures, even one such as you. Nor is there anyone to rescue you. 2 of your companions are dead, yes, even that meddlesome witch, and Murtaugh knows nothing of your presence here. Today is the day of your doom, Aragon Shadeslayer." Then the high priest tilted back its head and uttered a gruesome, gurgling whistle. From the dark doorway to the left of the altar, there appeared 4 bare-chested slaves. On their shoulders, they bore a platform with 2 large, shallow, cup-like protrusions in the middle. Within the protrusions lay a pair of oval objects, each about 1.5 feet long and half a foot thick. The objects were blue-black and pitted like sandstone. Time seemed to slow for Aragon. They can't be, he thought. Saphira's egg had been smooth, however, and veined like marble. Whatever these objects were, they were not dragon eggs. The alternatives frightened him even more. "Since you killed the old ones," said the high priest, "it is only fitting that you provide the food for their rebirth. You do not deserve such a great honor, but it will please the old ones, and in all things we strive to satisfy their desires. We are their faithful servants, and they are masters cruel and implacable, the three-faced god, the hunters of men, the eaters of flesh, and the drinkers of blood. To them, we offer up our bodies in hope of revelation into the mysteries of this life and in hope of absolution for our transgressions. As Tosk wrote, so shall it be." In unison, the leather-clad priests repeated, "As Tosk wrote, so shall it be." The high priest nodded. "The old ones have always nested on Helgrind, but in the time of my grandfather's father, Galbatorix stole their eggs and killed their young, and he forced them to swear fealty to him lest he eradicate their line entirely. He hollowed out the caves and tunnels they have used ever since, and to us, to their devoted acolytes, he gave charge of their eggs, to watch and to hold and to care for until they were needed. This we have done, and none may fault us for our service. But we pray that someday Galbatorix shall be overthrown, for none should bind the old ones to their will. It is an abomination." The deformed creature licked its lips, and to his disgust, Aragon saw that part of its tongue was missing, carved away by a knife. "You, too, we wish gone, Rider. The dragons were the old ones' greatest enemies. Without them, and without Galbatorix, there would be no one to stop the old ones from feasting where and how they will." As the high priest spoke, the 4 slaves bearing the platform walked forth and carefully lowered it from their shoulders onto the patterned disc, setting it down several paces in front of Aragon and Arya. Once they finished, they bowed their heads and retreated through the doorway from which they had come. "Who could ask for anything more than to feed a god with the marrow of their bones?" asked the high priest. "Rejoice, both of you, for today you receive the blessing of the old ones, and by your sacrifice, the record of your sins shall be washed clean and you shall enter the afterlife as pure as a newly born child." Then the high priest and its followers raised their faces toward the ceiling and began to intone a strange, oddly accented song that Aragon had trouble understanding. He wondered if it was in the dialect of Tosk. At times, he heard what he thought were words in the ancient language, mangled and misused, but still the ancient language. When the grotesque congregation finished, ending with another chorus of, as Tosk wrote, "So shall it be," the three novitiates shook the bells in an ecstasy of religious fervor, and the resulting clamor seemed loud enough to bring down the ceiling. Still shaking the bells, the novitiates filed out of the room. The 24 lesser priests departed next, and then, bringing up the rear of the procession, their limbless master, transported upon its bier by the 6 oiled slaves. The door closed behind them with an ominous boom, and Aragon heard a heavy bar fall into place on the other side. He turned to look at Arya. The expression in her eyes was that of despair, and he knew she had no more idea of how to escape than he did. He gazed upward again and pulled on the chain that held him, using as much of his strength as he dared. The sores on his wrists again tore open, and they sprinkled him with drops of blood. In front of them, the leftmost egg began to rock back and forth ever so slightly, and from it came a faint tapping, like the rapping of a tiny hammer. A profound sense of horror suffused Aragon. Of all the ways he could imagine dying, being eaten alive by a Rizak was by far the worst. He yanked on the chain with renewed determination, biting his gag to help him withstand the agony in his arms. The resulting pain caused his vision to flicker. Next to him, Arya thrashed and twisted as well, both of them fighting in deadly silence to free themselves. And still the tapping continued on the blue-black shell. It's no use, Aragon realized. The chain would not give. As soon as he accepted the fact, it became obvious that it would be impossible to avoid being hurt far worse than he already was. The only question was whether his injuries would be forced upon him or whether they would be of his own choosing. If nothing else, I have to save Arya. He studied the iron bands around his wrists. If I can break my thumbs, I might be able to pull my hands out. Then at least I could fight. Maybe I could grab a piece of the Rizak's shell and use it as a knife. With something to cut, he could free his legs as well, though the thought was so terrifying, he ignored it for the time being. All I would have to do is crawl out of the circle of stones. He would be able to use magic then, and he could stop the pain and the bleeding. What he was considering would only take a few minutes, but he knew they would be the longest minutes of his life. He drew in a breath in preparation. Left hand first. Before he could start, Arya screamed. He spun toward her and uttered a wordless exclamation as he saw the mangled fingers of her right hand. Her skin was pushed up like a glove toward her nails, and the white of bone showed amid crimson muscle. Arya sagged and appeared to lose consciousness for a moment, then she recovered and pulled on her arm once more. Aragon cried out with her as her hand slid through the metal cuff, tearing off skin and flesh. Her arm fell to her side, hiding the hand from his sight, though he could see the blood splattering on the floor by her feet. Tears blurred his eyes, and he shouted her name into his gag, but she seemed not to hear him. As she braced herself to repeat the process, the door to the right of the altar opened, and one of the golden-robed novitiates slipped into the chamber. Seeing him, Arya hesitated, though Aragon knew she would pull her other hand out of the manacle at the slightest hint of danger. The young man looked askance at Arya, then cautiously made his way to the center of the patterned disc, casting apprehensive glances at the egg that was rocking back and forth. The youth was slight, with large eyes and delicate features. It seemed obvious to Aragon that he had been chosen for his position because of his appearance. "Here," whispered the youth. "I brought these." From within his robes, he produced a file, a chisel, and a wooden mallet. "If I help, you have to take me with you. I can't stand it here any longer. I hate it. It's horrible. Promise you'll take me with you." Even before he finished speaking, Aragon was nodding his assent. As the young man started toward him, though, Aragon growled and motioned with his head in Arya's direction. It took a few seconds before the novitiate understood. "Oh, yes," murmured the young man, and went over to Arya instead. Aragon ground his teeth through the gag in anger over the youth's slowness. The harsh scrape of the file soon drowned out the tapping from within the wobbling egg. Aragon watched as best he could while there would be rescuers sought on a section of chain above Arya's left hand. "Keep the file on the same length, you." Aragon raged. The novitiate looked as if he had never used a file before, and Aragon doubted that the youth had the strength or endurance to cut through even a small amount of metal. Arya hung limply while the novitiate worked, her long hair covering her face. She trembled at regular intervals, and the fall of blood from her ruined hand continued unabated. To Aragon's dismay, the file did not seem to be leaving a mark on the chain. Whatever magics protected the metal, they were too strong for something as simple as a file to overcome. The novitiate huffed, appearing petulant at his lack of progress. He paused and wiped his brow, then, frowning, attacked the chain once again, elbows flailing, chest heaving, the sleeves of his robe flapping wildly. "Don't you realize it's not going to work?" thought Aragon. "Try the chisel on the shackles around her ankles instead." The young man continued as he was. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber, and Aragon saw a thin fissure appear at the top of the dark, pitted egg. The fissure lengthened, and a web of hairline fractures spread outward from it. Then the second egg began to wobble as well, and from it came another tap-tap-tapping, which joined with the first to form a maddening rhythm. The novitiate went pale, then dropped the file and backed away from Arya, shaking his head. I'm sorry. It's too late." His face crumpled, and tears rolled from his eyes. "I'm sorry." Aragon's alarm increased as the young man pulled a dagger from within his robes. "There's nothing else I can do," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Nothing else," he sniffed and moved toward Aragon. "It's for the best." As the young man stepped forward, Aragon wrenched at his bonds, trying to pull one of his hands out of the manacles. The iron cuffs were too tight, however, and all he succeeded in doing was scraping more of the skin off his wrists. "I'm sorry," whispered the young man as he stopped in front of Aragon and drew back the dagger. "No," Aragon shouted in his mind. A chunk of glittering amethyst hurtled out of the tunnel that had brought Aragon and Arya to the chamber. It struck the novitiate in the back of the head, and he fell against Aragon. Aragon flinched as he felt the edge of the dagger slide across his ribs. Then the young man tumbled to the floor and lay there, unconscious. From within the depths of the tunnel emerged a small, limping figure. Aragon stared, and as the figure moved into the light, he saw that it was none other than Solumbum. Relief swept through Aragon. The werecat was in his human form, and he was naked except for a ragged loincloth that looked as if it had been torn from the clothes of their attackers. His spiky black hair stood nearly on end, and a feral snarl disfigured his lips. Several cuts covered his forearms, his left ear hung drooping from the side of his head, and a strip of skin was missing from his scalp. He carried a blood-smeared knife. And following a few paces behind the werecat was the herbalist, Angela. "Infidels on the loose." "What an idiot," proclaimed Angela as she hurried to the edge of the patterned disc on the floor. She was bleeding from a number of cuts and scratches, and her clothes were stained with even more blood, which Aragon suspected was not her own. Otherwise, she appeared unharmed. All he had to do was, this. And she swung her sword with its transparent blade up and over her head, and brought the pommel down against one of the amethysts that ringed the disc. The crystal shattered with an odd snap, like a shock of static, and the light it emitted flickered and went out. The other crystals maintained their radiance. Without pause, Angela stepped to the next piece of amethyst and broke it as well, then the one after it, and so on. Never in his life had Aragon been so grateful to see anyone. He alternated between watching the herbalist and watching the cracks widening at the top of the first egg. The Rizak had almost pecked its way out, a fact it seemed to be aware of, for it was squeaking and tapping with increased vigor. Between the pieces of shell, Aragon saw a thick white membrane in the beaked head of the Rizak pushing blindly against it, horrible and monstrous. Hurry, Aragon thought as a fragment as large as his hand fell from the egg and clattered against the floor, like a plate made of fired clay. The membrane tore, and the young Rizak stuck its head out of the egg, revealing its barbed purple tongue as it uttered a triumphant screech. Slime dripped from its carapace, and a fungus-like smell pervaded the chamber. Aragon tugged at his bonds once more, futile as it was. The Rizak screeched again, then struggled to extricate itself from the remainder of the egg. It pulled one clawed arm free, but in the process it unbalanced the egg, which tipped to one side, spilling a thick, yellowish fluid across the patterned disc. The grotesque hatchling lay on its side for a moment, stunned. Then it stirred and got to its feet, where it stood, swaying and uncertain, clicking to itself like an agitated insect. Aragon stared, appalled and terrified, but also fascinated. The Rizak had a deep, ridged chest that made it look as if its ribs were on the outside of its body, not the inside. The creature's limbs were thin and knobby, like sticks, and its waist was narrower than any human's. Each leg had an extra backward-bending joint, something that Aragon had never seen before, but which accounted for the Rizak's unsettling gait. Its carapace appeared soft and malleable, unlike those of the more mature Rizak Aragon had encountered. No doubt it would harden in time. The Rizak tilted its head, its huge, protruding, pupil-less eyes catching the light, and it chittered as if it had just discovered something exciting. Then it took a tentative step toward Arya, and then another, its beak parting as it strained toward the pool of blood by her feet. Aragon shouted into his gag, hoping to distract the creature, but other than a quick glance, it ignored him. "Now," exclaimed Angela, and she broke the last of the crystals. Even as the shards of amethyst skittered across the floor, Solumbum leapt toward the Rizak. The werecat's form blurred in midair, head shrinking, legs shortening, fur sprouting, and he landed on all fours, his body once more that of an animal. The Rizak hissed and clawed at Solumbum, but the werecat dodged the blow and, faster than the eye could follow, slapped the Rizak's head with one of his large, heavy paws. The Rizak's neck broke with a crack, and the creature flew across the room and landed in a twisted heap, where it lay twitching for several seconds. Solumbum hissed, his one uninjured ear pressed flat against his skull. Then he wriggled out of the loincloth that was still tied around his hips and went over to sit and wait by the other egg. "What have you done to yourself?" said Angela as she hurried over to Arya. Arya wearily lifted her head, but she made no attempt to answer. With 3 swift strokes of her colorless blade, the herbalist sliced through Arya's remaining cuffs, as if the tempered metal were no harder than cheese. Arya fell to her knees and doubled over, pressing her injured hand against her stomach. With her other hand, she tore at her gag. The burning in Aragon's shoulders eased when Angela cut him free and he was finally able to lower his arms. He pulled the cloth out of his mouth and, in a hoarse voice, said, "We thought you were dead. They'll have to try harder than that if they want to kill me. Bunglers, the lot of them." Still doubled over, Arya began to chant spells of binding and healing. Her words were soft and strained, but she never faltered or misspoke. While she worked to repair the damage to her hand, Aragon healed the cut on his ribs as well as the sores on his wrists. Then he motioned at Solumbum and said, "Move." The werecat flicked his tail but did as Aragon asked. Lifting his right hand, Aragon said, "Risinger." A pillar of blue flame erupted around the second egg. The creature inside screamed. A terrible, unearthly sound, more like the screech of tearing metal than the cry of person or beast. Narrowing his eyes against the heat, Aragon watched with satisfaction as the egg burned. And let that be the last of them, he thought. When the screaming ceased, he extinguished the flame, and it went out from the bottom up. The silence afterward was unexpectedly complete, for Arya had finished her incantations and all was still. Angela was the first to stir. She went to Solumbum and stood over him, murmuring in the ancient language as she mended his ear and other wounds. Aragon knelt by Arya and put a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, then uncurled her body enough to show him her hand. The skin along the lower third of her thumb, as well as along the outer edge of her palm and across the back of her hand, was shiny and bright red. However, the muscles underneath appeared sound. "Why didn't you finish healing it?" he asked. "If you're too tired, I can." She shook her head. "I damaged several nerves, and I can't seem to repair them. I need Blodgrim's help. He is more skilled than I at manipulating flesh." "Can you fight?" "If I'm careful." He tightened his grip on her shoulder for a moment. "What you did. I only did what was logical. Most people wouldn't have had the strength. I tried, but my hand was too big. See?" And he held up his hand against hers. She nodded, then grasped his arm and slowly got to her feet. Aragon rose with her, providing her with a steady support. "We have to find our weapons," he said, "as well as my ring, my belt, and the necklace that dwarves gave me." Angela frowned. "Why your belt? Is it enchanted?" When Aragon hesitated, unsure whether to tell her the truth, Arya said, "You would not know the name of its maker, wise one, but during your travels, you must surely have heard tell of the belt of the 12 stars. The herbalist's eyes widened. "That belt? But I thought it was lost over 4 centuries ago, destroyed during the—" "We recovered it," said Arya flatly. Aragon could see that the herbalist longed to ask more questions, but she merely said, "I see. We can't waste time searching every room in this warren, though. Once the priests realize you've escaped, we'll have the whole pack of them nipping at our heels." Aragon motioned toward the novitiate on the floor and said, "Maybe he can tell us where they took our things." Dropping into a squat, the herbalist placed 2 fingers against the youth's jugular vein, feeling his pulse. Then she slapped his cheeks and peeled back his eyelids. The novitiate remained slack and motionless. His lack of response seemed to annoy the herbalist. "One moment," she said, closing her eyes. A slight frown creased her brow. For a while, she was still, then she sprang upward with sudden speed. What a self-absorbed little wretch. No wonder his parents sent him to join the priests. I'm surprised they put up with him as long as they did. "Does he know anything of use?" asked Aragon. "Only the path to the surface." She pointed toward the door to the left of the altar, the same door through which the priests had entered and departed. "It's amazing that he tried to free you. I suspect it's the first time in his life he's ever done anything of his own accord. We have to bring him with us." Aragon hated to say it, but duty compelled him. "I promised we would if he helped us. He tried to kill you." "I gave my word." Angela sighed and rolled her eyes. To Arya, she said, "I don't suppose you can convince him otherwise?" Arya shook her head, then hoisted the young man onto her shoulder without apparent effort. "I'll carry him," she said. "In that case," the herbalist said to Aragon, "you had best have this, since it seems you and I are to do most of the fighting." She handed him her short sword, then drew a poniard with a jeweled hilt from within the folds of her dress. "What is it made of?" Aragon asked as he peered through the transparent blade of the sword, noticing how it caught and reflected the light. The substance reminded him of diamond, but he could not imagine that anyone would make a weapon out of a gemstone. The amount of energy required to keep the stone from breaking with every blow would soon exhaust any normal magician. "Neither stone nor metal," said the herbalist. "A word of caution, though. You must take great care when handling it. Never touch the edge or allow anything you cherish to come near it, else you will regret it. Likewise, never lean the sword against something you might need, your leg, for example." Wary, Aragon held the sword farther away from his body. "Why?" "Because," said the herbalist with evident relish, "this is the sharpest blade in all of existence. No other sword or knife or axe can match the keenness of its edge, not even Brisinger. It is the ultimate embodiment of an incision-making instrument. This," she paused for emphasis, "is the archetype of an inclined plane. You'll not find its equal anywhere. It can cut through anything not protected by magic, and many things that are. Try it if you don't believe me." Aragon looked around for something to test the sword against. In the end, he strode over to the altar and swung the blade at one corner of the stone slab. "Not so quickly," cried Angela. The transparent blade passed through 4 inches of stone as if the granite were no harder than custard, then continued down toward his feet. Aragon yelped and jumped back, barely managing to stop his arm before he cut himself. The corner of the altar bounced off the step below and then tumbled clacking toward the middle of the room. The blade of the sword, Aragon realized, might very well be diamond after all. It would not need as much protection as he had assumed, since it would rarely meet with any substantial resistance. "Here," said Angela, "you had better have this as well." She unbuckled the sword's scabbard and gave it to him. "It's one of the few things you can't cut with that blade." It took Aragon a moment to find his voice after so nearly lopping off his toes. "Does the sword have a name?" Angela laughed. "Of course. In the ancient language, its name is Albiter, which means exactly what you think. But I prefer to call it Tinkledeath." "Tinkledeath." "Yes, because of the sound the blade makes when you tap it." She demonstrated with the tip of a fingernail and smiled at the resulting high-pitched note that pierced the darkened chamber like a ray of sunshine. "Now then, shall we be off?" Aragon checked to make sure they were not forgetting anything, then he nodded, strode to the left-hand door, and opened it as quietly as he could. Through the doorway was a long, broad hallway lit by torches. And standing guard in 2 smart rows, one along each side of the hallway, were 20 of the black-garbed warriors who had ambushed them earlier. They looked at Aragon and reached for their weapons. A curse ran through Aragon's mind, and he sprang forward, intending to attack before the warriors could draw their swords and organize themselves into an effective group. He had only covered a few feet, however, when a flicker of movement appeared next to each man. A soft, shadowy blur, like the motion of a windblown pennant seen at the edge of his vision. Without so much as a single cry, the 20 men stiffened and fell to the floor, dead, every last one of them. Alarmed, Aragon slowed to a stop before he ran into the bodies. Each of the men had been stabbed through an eye, as neat as could be. He turned to ask Arya and Angela if they knew what had happened, but the words died in his throat as he beheld the herbalist. She stood braced against a wall, leaning on her knees and panting heavily. Her skin had gone deathly white, and her hands were shaking. Blood dripped from her poniard. Awe and fear filled Aragon. Whatever the herbalist had done, it was beyond his understanding. "Wise one," said Arya, and she too sounded uncertain, "how did you manage to do this?" The herbalist chuckled between breaths, then said, "I used a trick I learned from my master, Tinga, ages ago. May 1,000 spiders bite his ears and knobbly bits." "Yes, but how did you do it?" insisted Aragon. "A trick like that might be useful in Urubayan." The herbalist chuckled again. "What is time but motion? And what is motion but heat? And are not heat and energy but different names for the same thing?" She pushed herself off the wall, walked over to Aragon, and patted him on the cheek. "When you understand the implications of that, you'll understand how and what I did. I won't be able to use the spell again today, not without hurting myself, so don't expect me to kill everyone the next time we run into a batch of men." With some difficulty, Aragon swallowed his curiosity and nodded. He stripped a tunic and a padded jerkin off one of the fallen men, and after donning the clothes, he led the way down the hall and through the archway at the far end. They encountered no one else in the complex of rooms and corridors thereafter, nor did they find any sign of their stolen possessions. Although Aragon was glad to avoid notice, the absence of even servants worried him. He hoped that he and his companions had not triggered alarms that had warned the priests of their escape. Unlike the abandoned chambers they had seen before the ambush, those they passed through now were filled with tapestries, furniture, and strange devices made of brass and crystal, the purpose of which Aragon could not fathom. More than once, a desk or a bookcase tempted him to pause and inspect its contents, but he always resisted the urge. They did not have time to read musty old papers, no matter how intriguing. Angela chose the path they took whenever there was more than one option, but Aragon remained in the lead, clutching the wire-wrapped hilt of Tinkeldeath with a grip so hard, his hand began to cramp. Soon enough, they arrived at a passageway ending in a flight of stone steps that narrowed as it rose. 2 novitiates stood by the stairs, one on either side, each holding a rack of bells such as Aragon had seen earlier. He ran at the 2 young men and managed to stab one novitiate through the neck before he could shout or ring his bells. The other, however, had time to do both before Solumbum leapt on him and bore him to the ground, tearing at his face, and the whole of the passageway rang with the clamor. "Hurry!" Aragon cried as he bounded up the stairs. At the top of the steps was a freestanding wall some 10 feet wide, covered with ornate scrollwork and carvings that seemed vaguely familiar to Aragon. He dodged around the wall and came out into a beam of rose-tinted light of such intensity that he faltered, confused. He lifted Tinkeldeath's scabbard to shade his eyes. Not 5 feet in front of him, the high priest sat on its bier, blood dripping from a cut on its shoulder. Another of the priests, a woman missing both her hands, sat kneeling by the side of the bier, catching the fall of blood in a golden chalice that she held clamped between her forearms. Both she and the high priest stared at Aragon with astonishment. Then Aragon looked past them and saw, as if in a series of lightning flashes, massive ribbed columns rising toward a vaulted ceiling that vanished into shadow. Stained glass windows set within towering walls, the windows on the left burning with light from the rising sun, those on the right dull and flat, lifeless. Pale statues standing between the windows. Rows of granite pews, dappled with different colors, extending all the way to the far-off entrance to the nave. And, filling the first 4 rows, a flock of leather-garbed priests, their faces upturned and their mouths opened in song, like so many hatchlings begging for food. He was, Aragon belatedly realized, standing in the great cathedral of Drosleona, on the other side of the altar he had once knelt before in reverence, long ago. The handless woman dropped the chalice and stood, throwing her arms out wide as she shielded the high priest with her body. Behind her, Aragon glimpsed the blue of Brisinger's sheath lying near the leading edge of the bier, and he thought he saw Aaron next to it. Before he could chase after his sword, 2 guards rushed toward him from either side of the altar, slashing at him with engraved, red-tasseled pikes. He sidestepped the first guard and sliced the shaft of the man's pike in half, sending the blade flying through the air. Then Aragon sliced the man himself in half. Tinkeldeath passed through his flesh and bones with shocking ease. Aragon dispatched the second guard just as quickly and turned to face a pair approaching from behind. The herbalist joined him, brandishing her poniard, and somewhere off to his left, Solumbum growled. Arya hung back from the fighting, still carrying the young man. The spilled blood from the chalice had coated the floor around the altar. The guard slipped in the puddle and the rear man fell and knocked his companion off his feet. Aragon shuffled toward them, never lifting his feet off the floor so as to avoid losing his balance, and before the guards could react, he slew them both, taking care to control the herbalist's enchanted blade as it effortlessly cut through the two men. As he did, Aragon was aware that the high priest was screaming, as if at a great distance, "Kill the infidels! Kill them! Don't let the blasphemers escape! They must be punished for their crimes against the old ones." The congregation of priests began to howl and stamp their feet, and Aragon felt their minds clawing at his, like a pack of wolves tearing at a weakened deer. He retreated deep within himself, warding off the attacks with techniques he had been practicing under Gladder's tutelage. It was difficult to defend himself from so many foes, however, and he feared that he would not be able to maintain his barriers for long. His one advantage was that the panicked, disorganized priests attacked him as individuals, not as a unit. Their combined might would have overwhelmed him. Then Arya's consciousness was pressing against his, a familiar, comforting presence amid the clutch of enemies scrabbling against his inner self. Relieved, he opened himself to her, and they joined their minds, even as he and Saphira would do, and for a time their identities merged and he lost the ability to determine where many of their shared thoughts and feelings came from. Together they stabbed with their minds at one of the priests. The man struggled to evade their grasp, like a fish wriggling through their fingers, but they tightened their grip and refused to let him escape. He was reciting a stilted, oddly worded phrase in an attempt to keep them out of his consciousness. Aragon assumed it was a scrap of scripture from the Book of Tosk. The priest lacked discipline, however, and his concentration soon wavered as he thought, "The infidels are too close to master. We have to kill them before, wait. No. No." Aragon and Arya seized upon the priest's weakness and quickly subjugated the man's thoughts to their will. Once they were certain he could not retaliate against them with mind or body, Arya cast a spell that, from examining the priest's memories, she knew could slip past his wards. In the third row of pews, a man screamed and burst into flame, green fire pouring from his ears, mouth, and eyes. The flames ignited the clothes of several priests close to him, and the burning men and women began to thrash and run about wildly, further disrupting the attacks against Aragon. The rippling flames sounded like branches snapping in a storm. The herbalist ran down from the altar and moved among the priests, stabbing here and there. Solumbum followed close at her heels, finishing off those she felled. After that, it was easy for Aragon and Arya to invade and seize control of their enemies' minds. Continuing to work together, they killed 4 more priests, at which point the rest of the congregation broke and scattered. Some fled through the vestibule that Aragon remembered led to the priory next to the cathedral, while others crouched behind the pews and wrapped their arms around their heads. 6 of the priests, however, neither fled nor hid, but rather charged Aragon, brandishing curved knives with what hands they still possessed. Aragon cut at the first priest before she could strike at him. To his annoyance, the woman was protected by a ward that stopped Tinkledeath half a foot from her neck, causing the sword to turn in his hand and a shock to run up his arm. With his left hand, Aragon swung at the woman. For whatever reason, the spell did not stop his fist, and he felt the bones in her chest give way as he knocked her sprawling into the people behind her. The remaining priests extricated themselves and resumed their charge. Stepping forward, Aragon blocked a clumsy slash from the foremost priest. Then, with a shout of, "Ha!" he drove his fist into the man's gut and sent him flying into a pew, which the priest struck with a nasty crack. Aragon killed the next man in a similar manner. A green and yellow dart buried itself in the throat of the priest to his right, and there was a tawny blur as Solumbum leapt past him and tackled another of the group. That left but one of Tosk's followers standing before him. With her free hand, Arya grabbed the woman by the front of her leather robes and threw her screaming 30 feet over the pews. 4 novitiates had lifted up the high priest's bier and were carrying it at a quick trot along the east side of the cathedral as they headed toward the front entrance of the building. Seeing them escaping, Aragon uttered a roar and bounded onto the altar, knocking a plate and goblet to the floor. From there, he jumped out over the bodies of the fallen priests. He landed lightly in the aisle and sprinted to the end of the cathedral, heading off the novitiates. The 4 young men stopped when they saw Aragon arrive at the doors. "Turn around," shrieked the high priest. "Turn around." Its servants obeyed, only to be confronted by Arya standing behind them, one of their own slung over her right shoulder. The novitiates yelped and turned sideways, darting between 2 rows of pews. Before they had gone more than a few feet, Solumbum stepped around the end of the pews and began to pad toward them. The werecat's ears were pressed flat against his skull, and the constant low rumble of his growl made Aragon's neck prickle. Close behind him came Angela, striding down the cathedral from the altar, her poniard in one hand and a green and yellow dart in the other. Aragon wondered how many weapons she had about herself. To their credit, the novitiates did not lose their courage or abandon their master. Instead, the four shouted and ran even faster at Solumbum, presumably because the werecat was the smallest and the closest of their opponents, and because they believed he would be the easiest to overcome. They were mistaken. In a single lithe movement, Solumbum crouched, jumped from the floor to the top of a pew. Then, without stopping, he leapt toward one of the two lead novitiates. As the werecat sailed through the air, the high priest shouted something in the ancient language. Aragon did not recognize the word, but the sound of it was unmistakably that of the elves' native language. Whatever the spell was, it seemed to have no effect on Solumbum, although Aragon saw Angela stumble as if she had been struck. Solumbum collided with the novitiate at whom he had flung himself, and the young man tumbled to the floor, screaming as Solumbum mauled him. The rest of the novitiates tripped over their companion's body, and the lot of them fell in a tangled heap, spilling the high priest off its bier and onto one of the pews, where the creature lay squirming like a maggot. Aragon caught up with them a second later, and with 3 swift strokes, he slew all of the novitiates, save the one whose neck Solumbum held clamped between his jaws. Once Aragon was sure the men were dead, he turned to strike down the high priest once and for all. As he started toward the limbless figure, another mind invaded his, probing and grasping at the most intimate parts of his self, seeking to control his thoughts. The vicious attack forced Aragon to stop and concentrate on defending himself from the intruder. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Arya and Solumbum also appeared immobilized. The herbalist was the sole exception. She paused for a moment when the attack commenced, but then she continued to walk with slow, shuffling steps toward Aragon. The high priest stared at Aragon, its deep-set, dark-ringed eyes burning with hate and fury. If the creature had had arms and legs, Aragon was convinced that it would have tried to tear out his heart with its bare hands. As it was, the malevolence of its gaze was so intense, Aragon half expected the priest to wiggle off the pew and start biting at his ankles. The assault on his mind intensified as Angela drew near. The high priest, for it had to be the high priest who was responsible, was far more skilled than any of its underlings. To engage in mental combat with 4 different people at once, and to present a credible threat to each of the 4, was a remarkable feat, especially when the enemies were an elf, a dragon rider, a witch, and a werecat. The high priest had one of the most formidable minds Aragon had ever encountered. If not for the help of his companions, Aragon suspected that he would have succumbed to the creature's onslaughts. The priest did things the likes of which Aragon had never experienced before, such as binding Aragon's stray thoughts to Arya's and Solumbum's, wrapping them into a knot of such confusion that for brief moments Aragon lost track of his own identity. At last Angela turned into the space between the pews. She picked her way around Solumbum, who crouched next to the novitiate he had killed, every hair on his body standing on end, and then carefully made her way over the corpses of the 3 novitiates Aragon had slain. As she approached, the high priest began to thrash like a hooked fish in an attempt to push itself farther up the pew. At the same time, the pressure on Aragon's mind lessened, although not enough for him to risk moving. The herbalist stopped when she reached the high priest, and the high priest surprised Aragon by giving up its struggle and lying panting on the seat of the bench. For a minute, the hollow-eyed creature and the short, stern-faced woman glared at each other, an invisible battle of wills taking place between them. Then the high priest flinched, and a smile appeared on Angela's lips. She dropped her poniard and, from within her dress, drew forth a tiny dagger with a blade the color of a ruddy sunset. Leaning over the high priest, she whispered, ever so faintly, "You ought to know my name, tongueless one. If you had, you never would have dared oppose us. Here, let me tell it to you." Ellipsis quote. Her voice dropped even lower then, too low for Aragon to hear, but as she spoke, the high priest blanched, and its puckered mouth opened, forming a round black oval, and an unearthly howl emanated from its throat, and the whole of the cathedral rang with the creature's baying. "Oh, be quiet," exclaimed the herbalist, and she buried her sunset-colored dagger in the center of the high priest's chest. The blade flashed white-hot and vanished with a sound like a far-off thunderclap. The area around the wound glowed like burning wood, then skin and flesh began to disintegrate into a fine, dark soot that poured into the high priest's chest. With a choked gargle, the creature's howl ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The spell quickly devoured the rest of the high priest, reducing its body to a pile of black powder, the shape of which matched the outline of the priest's head and torso. "And good riddance," said Angela with a firm nod. The tolling of the bell. Aragon shook himself as if waking from a bad dream. Now that he no longer had to fight off the high priest, he gradually became aware that the priory bell was tolling, a loud, insistent sound that reminded him of when the Rizak had chased him from the cathedral during his first visit to Dras Leona, with Brom. Murtaugh and Thorn will be here soon, he thought. We have to leave before then. He sheathed Tinkledeath and handed it to Angela. Here, he said, I think you'll want this. Then he pulled the corpses of the novitiates aside until he uncovered Brisinger. As his hand closed around the hilt, a sense of relief swept through him. Though the herbalist's sword was a good and dangerous blade, it was not his weapon. Without Brisinger, he felt exposed, vulnerable, the same as he did whenever he and Saphira were apart. It took him another few moments of searching to find his ring, which had rolled under one of the pews, and his necklace, which was wrapped around one of the handles of the bier. Among the pile of bodies, he also discovered Arya's sword, which she was pleased to recover. But of his belt, the belt of Beloth the Wise, there was no sign. Aragon looked under all the nearby pews, and he even ran back to the altar and inspected the area around it. It's not here, he finally said, despairing. He turned toward the freestanding wall that hid the entrance to the underground chambers. They must have left it in the tunnels. He cast his gaze in the direction of the priory. Or maybe, he hesitated, torn between the two options. Muttering the words under his breath, he cast a spell designed to find and lead him to the belt, but the only result he received was an image of smooth gray emptiness. As he had feared, there were wards around the belt that protected it from magical observation or interference, just as similar wards protected Brisinger. Aragon scowled and took a half-step toward the freestanding wall. The bell tolled louder than ever. Aragon called Arya from the other end of the cathedral, shifting the unconscious novitiate from one shoulder to the other. We have to go. But Oromus would understand. It's not your fault. But leave it. The belt has been lost before. We will find it again. But for now, we must fly. Hurry. Aragon cursed, spun around, and ran to join Arya, Angela, and Solembum at the front of the cathedral. Of all the things to lose, it seemed almost sacrilegious to abandon the belt when so many creatures had died to fill it with energy. Besides, he had a horrible feeling that he might have need of that energy before the day was out. Even as he and the herbalist pushed open the heavy doors that led out of the cathedral, Aragon sent his mind questing for Saphira, who he knew would be circling high above the city, waiting for him to contact her. The time for discretion had long since passed, and Aragon no longer cared if Murtaugh or some other magician sensed his presence. He soon felt the familiar touch of Saphira's consciousness. As their thoughts melded together once again, a certain tightness in Aragon's chest vanished. "What took you so long?" exclaimed Saphira. He could taste her worry, and he knew she had been considering descending upon Dras Leona and tearing it to pieces in search of him. He poured his memories into her, sharing everything that had happened to him since they parted. The process took a few seconds, by which time he, Arya, Angela, and the werecat had exited the cathedral and were running down the front steps. Without pausing to give Saphira an opportunity to make sense of his jumbled recollections, Aragon said, "We need a distraction, now." She acknowledged his statement, and he could feel her tip into a steep dive. "Also, tell Nasuda to start her attack. We'll be at the south gate in a few minutes. If the Varden aren't there when we open it, I don't know how we're going to escape." Black Shrike Thorn Cave. The cool, moist, morning air off water whistled past Saphira's head as she dove toward the rat nest city half lit by the rising sun. The low rays of light made the smelly wood eggshell buildings stand out in high relief, their western sides black with shadow. The wolf elf in Aragon's shape who was riding on her back shouted something at her, but the hungry wind tore at his words, and she could not make out his meaning. He began to ask her questions with his song-filled mind, but she did not wait to let him finish. Instead, she told him of Aragon's plight and asked him to alert Nasuda that now was the time for action. How the shadow of Aragon that glowed her more was supposed to fool anyone, Saphira could not understand. He did not smell like her partner of heart and mind, nor did his thoughts feel like Aragon's. Still, the two legs seemed impressed by the apparition, and it was two legs they were trying to fool. On the left side of the Rat Nest City, the glittering shape of Thorn lay stretched out along the battlements above the southern gate. He lifted his crimson head, and she could tell that he had spotted her hurtling toward the breakbone ground, as she had expected. Her feelings toward Thorn were too complicated to sum up in a few brief impressions. Every time she thought of him, she became confused and uncertain, something she was unaccustomed to. Nevertheless, she was not about to let the upstart whelp best her in battle. As the dark chimneys and sharp-edged roofs grew larger, she spread her wings a bit more, feeling the increased strain in her chest, shoulders, and wing muscles as she began to slow their descent. When she was only a few hundred feet above the closely packed swell of buildings, she swooped upward and allowed her wings to snap out to their full extent. The effort required to stop her fall was immense. For a moment, it felt as if the wind might tear her wings free of their sockets. She shifted her tail to maintain balance, then wheeled over the city until she located the Black Shrike Thorn Cave where the blood-mad priests worshipped. Tucking in her wings again, she dropped the last number of feet and, with a thunderous crash, landed on the middle of the cathedral's roof. She dug her claws into the tiles of the roof to stop herself from sliding off into the street below. Then she threw back her head and roared as loudly as she could, challenging the world and everything in it. There was a bell clanging in the tower of the building next to the Black Shrike Thorn Cave. She found the noise irritating, so she twisted her neck and loosed a jet of blue and yellow flame at it. The tower did not catch fire, as it was stone, but the rope and beams supporting the bell ignited, and a few seconds later, the bell fell crashing into the interior of the tower. That pleased her, as did the two legs round ears who ran screaming from the area. She was a dragon, after all. It was only right that they should fear her. One of the two legs paused by the edge of the square in front of the Black Shrike Thorn Cave, and she heard him shout a spell at her, his voice like the squeaking of a frightened mouse. Whatever the spell was, Aragon's wards shielded her from it. At least she assumed they did, for she noticed no difference in how she felt or in the appearance of the world around her. The wolf elf in Aragon's shape killed the magician for her. She could feel how Blodgrim grasped hold of the spellcaster's mind and wrestled the two legs round ears' thoughts into submission, whereupon Blodgrim uttered a single word in the ancient elf magic language, and the two legs round ears fell to the ground, blood seeping from his open mouth. Then the wolf elf tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Ready yourself, Bright Scales. Here they come." She saw Thorn rising above the edge of the rooftops, Aragon half-brother Murtaugh a small, dark figure on his back. In the light of the morning sun, Thorn shone and sparkled almost as brilliantly as she herself did. Her scales were cleaner than his, though, as she had taken special care when grooming earlier. She could not imagine going into battle looking anything but her best. Her enemies should not only fear her, but admire her. She knew it was vanity on her part, but she did not care. No other race could match the grandeur of the dragons. Also, she was the last female of her kind, and she wanted those who saw her to marvel at her appearance and to remember her well, so if dragons were to vanish forevermore, two legs would continue to speak of them with the proper respect, awe, and wonder. As Thorn climbed 1,000 or more feet above the Rat Nest City, Saphira spared a quick glance around to make sure that partner of her heart and mind Aragon was nowhere near the Black Shrike Thorn Cave. She did not want to hurt him by accident in the fight that was about to take place. He was a fierce hunter, but he was small and easily squished. She was still working to unravel the dark echoing painful memories Aragon had shared with her, but she understood enough of them to know that events had once again proved what she had long believed, that whenever she and her partner of heart and mind were apart, he ended up in trouble of one form or another. Aragon, she knew, would disagree, but his latest misadventure had done nothing to convince her otherwise, and she felt a perverse satisfaction in having been right. Once Thorn reached an appropriate height, he twisted round and dove toward her, flames shooting from his open maw. The fire she did not fear, Aragon's wards would shield her from it, but Thorn's massive weight and strength would allow him to quickly exhaust any spells designed to shield her from physical danger. To protect herself, she ducked and pressed her body flat against the cathedral, even as she twisted her neck and snapped at Thorn's pale underbelly. A swirling wall of flames engulfed her, rumbling and roaring like a giant waterfall. The flames were so bright, she instinctively closed her inner eyelids, the same as she would when underwater, and then the light was no longer blinding. The flames soon cleared, and as Thorn rushed past overhead, the tip of his thick, rib-bruising tail traced a line across the membrane of her right wing. The scratch bled, but not profusely, and she did not think it would cause her much difficulty while flying, painful though it was. Thorn dove at her again and again, trying to bait her into taking to the air. She refused to budge, however, and after a few more passes, he tired of harrying her and landed on the other end of the Black Shrike Thorn Cave, his huge wings outstretched for balance. The entire building shook as Thorn dropped to all fours, and many of the gem glass picture windows in the walls below shattered and fell tinkling to the ground. Thorn was bigger than her now, as a result of the Eggbreaker Galbatorix's meddling, but she was not intimidated. She had more experience than Thorn, and besides, she had trained with Gladder, who had been larger than both she and Thorn combined. Also, Thorn dared not kill her, nor did she think he wanted to. The red dragon snarled and stepped forward, the tips of his claws scraping against the tiles on the roof. She snarled in return and retreated several feet, until she could feel her tail pressing against the base of the spires that rose up like a wall at the front of the Black Shrike Thorn Cave. The tip of Thorn's tail twitched, and she knew he